The bridge hummed even when Noah stood still. He'd crossed it 1,000 times, cutting through after violin lessons, headphones on, metronome ticking in his pocket, but tonight he heard it. A low drone, almost below hearing, rising from the iron latticework like something alive. Sodium lamps cast orange pools along the walkway. Between them, shadows turned the riveted trusses into cathedral ribs arching over the gorge. He stopped mid-span and pulled out his earbuds. The hum clarified. Not mechanical, not traffic. Wind threading through the 1890s ironwork, finding some resonant frequency in all that old geometry. His violin teacher would call it an aeolian tone. Wind-driven, self-sustaining. His phone said it was 110 Hz, maybe 115. Close to an A, but flat and restless. That's when he saw the fork. It was bolted to a gusset plate where two diagonal braces met, massive and industrial, easily 3 feet tall. Steel tuning fork, the kind you'd see in a physics textbook blown up to monument scale. Someone had engraved numbers along one tine, a worn scale half obscured by rust. 2 heavy bolts with wing nuts protruded from the shaft, clearly meant to slide up and down to change the fork's mass distribution. Change the pitch. Noah touched it with one knuckle. It was cold, and it buzzed faintly under his fingertip, picking up the bridge's hum like a sympathetic string. He had a wrench in his backpack. He'd been tightening his violin's tailpiece before rehearsal. The temptation was stupid and immediate. Strike it. See what it sounds like. See if the engraved scale meant anything. He swung the wrench lightly against the left tine. The fork sang, a pure, high C-sharp, bright and cutting. The sodium lamps flickered. Not a brownout flicker, but something faster, strobing, like an old film projector catching. The river below jumped, ripples appearing 10 feet upstream of where they'd been. Stars smeared across the sky in short arcs. Noah staggered, grabbing the handrail as the world stuttered around him. Then it stopped. The fork still rang, its tone decaying slowly. The bridge looked the same iron, same lights, but the air felt different. Cleaner, maybe. He checked his phone. No signal. The date display blinked, confused, then settled. October 28th, 2024, last year. He stood there gripping the rail while his heart tried to catch up. The fork's ring faded to silence. The bridge hummed on, indifferent. A car passed behind him, an old sedan he didn't recognise, and he realised he was shaking. When the wind died, maybe 5 minutes later, maybe 10, the fork began to ring again on its own, softly, catching the bridge's fundamental and building on it. The world strobed. Noah held the rail and closed his eyes. When he opened them, the date on his phone read October 28th, 2025. Now. Home. He walked off the bridge on legs that didn't quite feel like his own. Halfway to Aunt Liv's apartment, he noticed the high-frequency hiss in his right ear. Tinnitus. And when he got home and started his usual late-night production session, the top end of his mix sounded muffled. Cymbals had lost their shimmer. Cricket sounds outside his window had gone silent. He didn't sleep. The next morning he told Sarah. They sat in the physics club room during free period, and he showed her the recording he'd made on his phone. 5 seconds of the fork's strike, the visual spectrum analyzer showing a clean spike at C-sharp, and underneath it the overlapping timestamp stuttering backward. She watched it 3 times without speaking. "You went back a year," she said finally, and came back when the fork rang on its own. And now I can't hear anything above maybe 14 kilohertz. Hearing loss? From one jump? I don't think it's damage. I think it's cost. Sarah pulled up a blank sheet in her notes app and started sketching. If pitch determines distance, higher pitch, shorter hop, then we need a map. That scale on the fork, those numbers, they have to correspond to years. They went to the bridge that afternoon. Noah brought his tuning app and a roll of masking tape. Sarah brought a laser measure and a frequency counter. They spent 2 hours documenting the fork, photographing the engraved scale, measuring the bolt positions, recording the bridge's ambient hum at different wind speeds. Sarah stuck strips of masking tape along the fork's shaft and wrote frequencies in Sharpie, building a ladder. Noah tested the sliding bolts. They moved grudgingly, corroded threads protesting, but they moved. "You're not jumping again," Sarah said. "I know. I'm serious. You've already lost high-frequency hearing. Next time it could be mid-range, voices, music. I know." but he was already thinking about it. About tuning the fork to a specific year. About what you could fix if you knew the cost ahead of time. Aunt Liv had lost her car keys 3 weeks ago. She'd been running late for a night shift, torn the apartment apart, finally called a locksmith for $80 they didn't have. The keys had turned up 2 days later behind the microwave. If Noah could jump back 4 weeks, leave the keys on the counter before she looked, save her the stress and the money, would that be worth another slice of hearing? He told himself it was about helping. He told himself it was about understanding the rules. But really, he just wanted to know if he could tune a life the way he tuned a track, adjusting levels until everything sat perfectly in the mix. He went back alone. Higher pitch this time. He slid the bolts up the shaft, raising the fork's frequency to an F-sharp 2 octaves above middle C. The engraved scale suggested that would be a short hop. He struck it with the wrench, and the world strobed through 4 weeks in a cascade of sodium lamp flicker. October 1st, 2025. He walked to the apartment, used the spare key, found Liv's keys on the kitchen counter where she always left them, and moved them to the hook by the door. Then he walked back to the bridge and waited for the wind to die. The fork rang naturally. The world stuttered home, and Noah lost another band. The brightness of consonants, the crisp attack of snare drums, the way Sarah's voice used to hiss slightly on S sounds. It all blurred into a kind of soft-edged mush. He could still hear speech, still make out melodies, but the clarity was gone. Liv noticed the keys on the hook the next morning. She didn't say anything, just grabbed them and left for her shift. Noah sat in his room with his headphones on, trying to EQ back the frequencies he'd lost, knowing it was impossible. Sarah found out anyway. She saw him struggling in physics lab, not hearing the timers beep, and she cornered him in the hallway afterward. You jumped again. 4 weeks. Small one. And, I can't hear your sibilants anymore. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were furious. You're going to keep doing this, aren't you? You're going to tune yourself into silence, and I'll stop. When you can't hear me at all? He didn't have an answer. She walked away. But 3 days later, she came back. If you're going to be stupid, she said, at least be scientific about it. She handed him a small device, a vibrotactile metronome, the kind used by deaf musicians. It strapped to his wrist and pulsed against his skin in rhythm. Bone conduction headphones are next. You're going to need to feel sound, not just hear it. They tested the bridge together after that, mapping its behaviour. The hum varied with wind speed and direction. Crosswinds from the northwest made it sing loudest, usually between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. when thermal shifts turned the gorge into a wind tunnel. The fork responded to the bridge's vibration, ringing sympathetically whenever the ambient tone matched its natural frequency. By adjusting the sliding bolts, you could tune the fork to match or mismatch that frequency. Match it, and the fork would sustain indefinitely as long as the wind blew. Mismatch it, and the fork would only ring when struck. Sarah rigged a sensor net. Accelerometers taped to the fork's tines, a phone app that graphed vibration amplitude in real time. Noah could watch the peaks even when he couldn't hear the tone. It helped, but it also made him realise how much he was losing. Music wasn't just frequency data. It was colour and texture, the lived experience of sound. No graph could give that back. He jumped once more, a longer hop lowering the fork's pitch to an A-flat. The world strobed backward through decades. The bridge's LED lamps flickered into old incandescent bulbs. The asphalt approach turned to gravel. Rust accumulated and then vanished as fresh paint appeared. He landed in 1987. The bridge looked younger, sharper, its ironwork a deep municipal green instead of the oxidized brown he knew. He walked the span, touching the rails, feeling how solid everything was. No missing rivets, no patched welds. It hummed the same hum, but cleaner, somehow less burdened. Near the centre gusset plate, someone had left a notebook, the kind with graph paper and a hard cover. Noah flipped it open. Engineering diagrams, resonance calculations, spectrum analyses. A name on the inside cover, James Calder, Acoustical Survey, April 1987. Marginal notes in tight handwriting, fork installed June, natural Frackian matches bridge fundamental at 112 Hz. Stable resonance confirmed, recommend dampers if municipal noise complaints persist. Noah photographed every page. Then he waited on the rail until the fork rang itself home. The strobe carried him forward through years of weathering, past the millennium into LED lights and cell towers. When he landed now, the tinnitus had spread. A roaring white noise filled the middle of his hearing range like static from a dead channel. Sarah's voice sounded underwater. Aunt Liv's too. He could still make out words, but only if he watched their lips. He told them he had an ear infection. Liv made him an appointment with an ENT. He cancelled it. That's when he met Calder. It was midnight. Noah had gone to the bridge to check the sensor readings. Sarah wanted data on how the fork's vibration changed with temperature. He expected to be alone, but someone was already there, a man in his 60s, grey hair pulled into a short ponytail, wearing a canvas jacket and work gloves. He had a toolbox open at his feet and was adjusting something on the fork's mounting plate. Noah's phone buzzed. The accelerometer app spiked. The fork was ringing, sustaining, holding a perfect tone, but there was no wind. The air in the gorge was completely still. "Don't touch it," the man said without turning round. His voice was rough, worn. "Let it sing." Noah stayed by the rail. The fork hummed on, impossibly sustained. The world didn't strobe. No time jump, just that endless ringing. The man, Calder, Noah was sure now, adjusted a small device clamped to the gusset plate. A mechanical shaker, the kind used to test vibration tolerance in engineering labs. It fed a controlled pulse into the structure, keeping the fork driven. "You're holding it," Noah said. "Keeping it from decaying. Keeping it perfect." Calder straightened and looked at him. His eyes were calm, even gentle. "You're the boy who's been jumping? I can tell. The way you hold your head, favouring one ear. How many bands have you lost?" 3. "And you'll lose more. Unless you learn what I learned. If you never let the tone decay, the moment never ends." "That's not how it works. You have to let it ring naturally to come home." "Home to what? Entropy? Loss?" "I found the perfect night. April 15th, 1994. My wife, healthy. The bridge lights just replaced. Warm wind. We walked this span together and she laughed when the hum made her ribs vibrate. I can keep that night forever if the fork never stops." Noah looked at the shaker, at the gloved hands, at the fork still singing its locked tone. "You can't hear it anymore, can you?" Calder smiled faintly. "Not for years. But I don't need to. I have the readouts. The accelerometers don't lie." "And everyone else in town? They're stuck too?" "They don't know. Time passes for them normally, within the locked year. Only the bridge remembers. You can't hold a moment forever. That's not living." "No," Calder agreed. "But it's not losing either." He packed his tools. "When you've spent enough years trying to tune your life, you'll understand. Perfection is a pitch you never release." He walked off the bridge, leaving the shaker running. Noah checked the app. The fork was sustaining at 112 Hz, the bridge's fundamental, locked in resonance. As long as that shaker ran, the fork would never complete a natural ring. No one could jump home. He called Sarah. She arrived 20 minutes later on her bike, helmet crooked, carrying a backpack full of sensors. They examined the setup. The shaker was bolted through the gusset plate, powered by a battery pack hidden in the truss hollow. Calder had also installed wind baffles, thin metal vanes positioned to catch any crosswind and deflected away from the fork. Even if the shaker died, the wind couldn't ring the fork naturally, it was locked. "How long has this been running?" Sarah asked. Noah checked the battery. "Weeks, maybe. There are spares in his toolbox." "So everyone who jumped can't come back, not unless we break the lock." Sarah started taking measurements. Wind speed, ambient vibration, the precise frequency of the driven tone. She mapped the baffle positions with her laser measure and photographed the shaker's mounting. "We need to stop the drive and block any wind input, but we can't touch the fork. If we do, we'll add our own energy and it won't be a natural ring. How do we let it decay without touching it? We don't let it. We create the conditions where it will." She pulled up a fluid dynamics app on her phone, started modelling wind flow around the bridge. The baffles are redirecting wind from the northwest. If we remove them and install temporary windbreaks on the upwind trusses, not touching the fork's structure, just blocking the wind path, we can create a still pocket around it. Then we kill the shaker, set the fork to your home pitch, and let it find its own resonance in the ambient vibration. And if it doesn't, then we're guessing. But it's physics. Vibration couples through the structure. If the fork's tuned to the right frequency, and there's any ambient energy, it'll respond. They planned it for dawn. The wind died at sunrise. Thermal equilibrium, the gorge and the air the same temperature, no crossflow. They'd have maybe 10 minutes of dead calm, enough for one clean ring. Noah didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed feeling the vibrotactile metronome pulse against his wrist, watching the accelerometer app graph the bridge's continuous hum. The tinnitus roared in the frequencies he'd lost. He tried to remember what symbols sounded like, what bird song sounded like, what Sarah's full voice sounded like. Memory wasn't enough. Audio wasn't just data. It was presence, dimension, the texture of the world. He'd traded it for control, and control had given him nothing but silence. At 5 a.m, Sarah texted, "Bridge in 30. They met under the sodium lamps. Sarah had tarps, bungee cords, and a cordless drill. Noah had his wrench and his phone. They worked quickly. The wind baffles came off first, 6 vanes, each one bolted to a truss bay. They stacked them on the walkway. Then they rigged windbreaks. Tarps stretched across the upwind trusses, positioned to block crossflow without touching the fork's gusset plate. Sarah checked every anchor point twice. The fork can't feel us working. Vibration isolation is critical. Noah found the shaker's battery pack and disconnected it. The fork's tone wavered, started to decay, then stopped, still humming, sustained by something else. He traced the vibration to a rattling street sign bolted to the handrail. Wind was pushing it, and it was feeding tiny pulses into the bridge structure, keeping the fork alive. "Grease the bolts," Sarah said, handing him a tube of lithium grease. Noah applied it to every rattling joint, every loose sign, every vibrating fixture within 10 yards of the fork. The ambient noise dropped. The fork's tone softened but still held, sustained by the bridge's fundamental hum. "Now we tune it," Sarah said. Noah pulled out his phone, opened the spectrum analyzer. He couldn't hear the fork anymore. His hearing loss had erased that frequency band, but he could see its peak on the graph. He needed to slide the mass bolts to match his home year pitch. The question was, what pitch was that? He tried to remember. The first jump, accidental, 1 year back. He'd had the bolts in a mid-range position, and the fork had rung at C-sharp. The 4-week jump had been F-sharp, bolts high. The long jump to 1987 had been a flat, bolts low. If pitch mapped to time distance, and his target was now, then he needed the fork's natural frequency, the pitch it would sing without any bolt adjustment. He checked Calder's notebook photos. Natural frequency, 112 Hz. Fork, fundamental, A, 110 Hz. Adjusted to A-flat for stability. Noah loosened the wing nuts and slid the bolts to their middle position, where the wear mark suggested they'd lived for decades. The spectrum analyzer showed the fork's peak shift downward, settling near 110 Hz, home pitch. The sky was lightening, pink clouds over the gorge. The wind had dropped to nothing. Sarah's ribbons hung limp from the trusses. Noah checked the accelerometer. The fork was still vibrating faintly, picking up the bridge's residual hum, but it wasn't ringing. Not yet. "We need a trigger," Sarah said. "Something to start it without touching it." Noah looked at the handrail. "I strike the rail. It conducts through the structure. The fork picks it up. Will that count as natural? It's ambient vibration. The fork finds its own pitch. Do it." Noah raised the wrench and struck the rail once, a clean hit that sent a shiver through the ironwork. The bridge hummed in response. The fork's tines began to vibrate, softly at first, then building, resonating with the 110 Hz fundamental that lived in the structure. The accelerometer spiked. The tone was growing. That's when Calder came running. He appeared from the far side of the bridge, moving faster than a man his age should, still wearing the canvas jacket, work gloves on. "Don't let it decay," he shouted. "You don't understand. If it rings out, I lose her, I lose that night." Sarah stepped into his path. He tried to go around her, but she moved with him, blocking. "It has to end," she said. "You can't hold a moment forever." "Why not? Why let time take everything? I found the equation, I built the tools, and you locked everyone else out. We can't go home because you won't let go." Calder stopped. His face was anguished, lined with years of choosing the same moment over and over. Noah could see it now. The man was a ghost, haunting his own perfect night, unable to live forward. The fork rang on, its tone pure and sustaining, decaying so slowly it felt like forever. "She wouldn't want this," Noah said quietly. She'd want you to let her go. Calder's shoulders sagged. He stepped back from the fork, pulled off his gloves. I can't hear it anymore, he whispered. I haven't heard it in years. I just watched the numbers. Is it beautiful? Noah checked his phone. The waveform was a perfect sine, decaying in smooth exponential curves. I can't hear it either, but yeah, I think it is. They stood together in the dawn light, Noah, Sarah, Calder, and watched the fork's vibration decay on 3 separate screens. The accelerometer traced a downward slope. The spectrum analyzer showed the 110 Hz peak narrowing, fading. The tone held for 30 seconds, 40, a minute. The bridge hummed underneath it. The gorge filled with pink light. The fork sang softer, softer. Then it stopped. The world strobed. Sodium lamps flickered, though most had already switched off for daylight. The river ripples jumped. Stars, pale against the brightening sky, smeared and settled. Noah's phone blinked and showed October 29th, 2025. Now, home. The tinnitus didn't vanish. The lost frequencies didn't come back. Noah stood on the bridge in the early light, hearing the world through a narrowed band, and felt the vibrotactile metronome pulse against his wrist. He'd lost clarity. He'd lost brightness. But he could still hear the low hum of traffic starting on the distant highway. He could still feel the bridge vibrate under his feet. Hearing wasn't just ears, it was touch, sight. The way vibration moved through bone and made sense of the world. Sarah was watching him. You okay? He nodded. Different, but okay. Calder was gone. They found a note tucked under the fork's mounting plate. Written on a torn piece of engineering paper, "Thank you for letting it end." No, signature. They never saw him again. Sarah filed a report with the city's public works department, explaining that the bridge's tuning fork was a safety hazard, unstable resonance, potential structural issues. Within a month, they'd sent a crew. The fork came down. They installed detuners along the truss bays, damping vanes that broke up the wind-driven hum. The bridge still stood, still carried pedestrians over the gorge, but it no longer sang. Noah spent that winter learning new ways to listen. Bone conduction headphones let him feel bass frequencies through his jaw. Spectrum analyzers let him see the shape of sound. He composed a piece called One Free Ring, built entirely from recorded bridge hums, fork overtones, and the spectral data from that final decay. He couldn't hear all of it, not with his damaged ears, but he could see it on the screen, could feel it through the metronome on his wrist. Sarah said it was beautiful. Aunt Liv said it made her cry, though she couldn't explain why. On clear nights, Noah still walked to where the bridge used to hum. The iron was quieter now, muted by the detuners, but sometimes when the wind came from the northwest he could feel a faint vibration through the handrail. A ghost of the old resonance. He'd stand there with his phone out watching the spectrum analyzer for any trace of 110 Hz. It never appeared. The fork was gone. Its bolts and tines melted down or sold for scrap. But the bridge remembered. Structures always do. He'd lost something tuning his life, but he'd gained something too, a way of listening that didn't depend on perfect ears. Sarah taught him to read vibration the way he used to read sheet music. Aunt Liv learned some sign language, just in case. He adjusted. The last time Sarah mentioned it, they were sitting on the bridge at midnight, tops and sensors packed away. "Do you regret it?" she asked. Noah thought about it, about the frequencies he'd never hear again, about Calder, trapped in his perfect moment, about the fork ringing its last natural tone, decaying into silence. "No," he said finally. "I learned to let go. That's worth more than perfect pitch." The bridge hummed softly beneath them. No strobe, no time slip. Just iron and wind and the long drop to the river. Noah felt the vibration through his hands on the rail, felt the metronome pulse against his wrist. He couldn't hear the hum anymore, but he knew it was there. That was enough. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder. The gorge filled with the sound of moving water. Stars wheeled overhead, slow and constant, marking time the way they always had. The bridge held them, the way it held everyone who crossed, bearing the weight without complaint. Somewhere in the city, frequencies rose and fell, music, voices, the hum of transformers and traffic. Noah couldn't hear most of it, but he felt the world vibrate, and that was a kind of listening too. The fork was gone, but its lesson remained. Perfection isn't a pitch you hold forever. It's a ring you let decay, trusting that silence will bring something new. Noah stood up, helped Sarah pack the last of her equipment, and they walked off the bridge together into the ordinary night, leaving the iron to its quiet song. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The storm came in low and grey, riding the back of a wind that smelled like salt and iron. Kai stood at the base of the lighthouse, one hand steadying the canvas bag that held the sextant, the other clutching a phone whose screen glowed with 100 small squares of memory. The tower rose above, white stone gone yellow in the fog, its lantern room dark save for the slow rotation of something vast inside. The radio crackled. Rin's voice, steady as always, threaded through static. "You're clear to climb. Generators holding, but the pressure's dropping fast. You've got maybe 2 hours before the next band hits." "Copy," Kai said, though the word felt thin against the wind. The foghorn sounded low and animal, shaking the ground beneath worn boots. The climb began. Inside, the tower was all spiral and echo. Iron steps, wet with condensation, wound upward through chambers that had once been living quarters, storage, watch posts. Now they were empty, save for the smell of rust and old rope. Kai counted the turns, breath fogging, legs burning. 83 steps to the service room, 24 more to the catwalk, then the final ladder, vertical and cold, into the lantern room itself. And there it was. The Fresnel lens hung like a cathedral made of light and geometry. First order, someone had said once, though Kai never learned what that meant until standing beneath it. 8 feet tall, a cylinder of crystal prisms arranged in concentric rings, each facet ground and beveled to catch every scrap of light and hurl it seaward. In daylight it threw rainbows across the walls. At night, when the mantle burned, it became something else, a machine for bending time. Kai moved to the window, pressing palms against cold glass. The fog lay thick as wool, pressing against the tower. Somewhere below, the harbour lights bled orange through the murk. The lens rotated on its mercury bath, ancient gears clicking, and as it turned, the beam swung across the fog outside. Rings appeared. Not the solid bar of light Kai had expected, but circles. Spinning circles painted onto the fog's surface, one inside another, like the growth rings of some impossible tree. They moved with the lens, sweeping across the night, and Kai understood with a jolt that they were not rings at all but tracks. Star tracks. The beam, fracturing through the prisms, was drawing the paths of constellations as they wheeled overhead. Polaris, almost still, a small circle near the centre. Deneb and Vega, wider arcs. Sirius, low and fast, its ring stretching toward the horizon. But one ring was broken, a gap, clean as a missing tooth, where the light should have been. The lens turned, and the gap turned with it, a dark interruption in the otherwise perfect geometry. Kai pulled the sextant from the bag, an old brass instrument that had belonged to someone's grandfather. Polished smooth by decades of thumbs. The eyepiece was cold. Through it, the stars sharpened, and when the broken ring swung past the window again, Kai sighted the gap, aligning the crosshair with the empty space where light should fall. The world lurched. Not pain, exactly. More like the moment between steps, when the foot hasn't yet found the ground. The foghorn sounded again, but lower, thicker, as if heard through water. When Kai looked up, the lantern room was the same but different. The brass was brighter, the walls less scarred. Outside, the fog still pressed close, but the harbour lights were fewer now, arranged in patterns that made no sense. The radio hissed, not Rin's voice, but silence, deep and old. Kai fumbled for the phone. The screen lit. The gallery opened, but the photos were wrong. The latest one, the shot of the pier at sunset taken 3 days ago, was gone. Just gone. The next image, a selfie with Rin at the harbour wall, sat where the sunset should have been. Kai scrolled, heart pounding. Everything else seemed intact, but the pier photo had vanished as if it had never existed. A sound from below. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, climbing the iron spiral. Kai backed against the lens housing, gripping the sextant. The footsteps stopped. A figure emerged through the hatch, tall and angular, wearing a keeper's coat that hung to the knees. The face was lined, weathered, eyes the colour of seawater. "You shouldn't be here," the man said. Not angry, just stating fact. Kai started, then stopped. What was there to say? I jumped through time. I broke your lighthouse. I'm trying to fix the lens. The man, Keeper Hale, Kai would learn later, studied the sextant in Kai's hands. You used the gap. I didn't know. No one ever does. Hale moved to the window, gazing at the fog rings as they spun past. It's been broken for years. Decades, maybe. I've seen it happen before. Someone tries to measure it, align with the missing piece, and they slip. Forward or back doesn't matter. The lens doesn't care. How do I get home? Hale turned, and for a moment something like pity crossed his face. Dawn. You set the lens to the true heading at first light and relight the mantle. The rings lock, the gap seals, time settles. He paused. But every correction costs something. You'll learn that soon enough. Before Kai could ask what he meant, Hale descended the ladder and was gone, footsteps fading into the stone below. Kai stood alone in the lantern room watching the rings spin. The broken one came around again, its gap yawning. Outside, 1974 fog pressed against glass that had been installed in 1889. Somewhere in the present, Rin was probably calling on the radio, wondering why Kai had gone silent. Somewhere in the phone, a photo of a pier no longer existed. The lens turned. The rings painted their courses, and Kai understood, with the clarity of cold water, that this was not a puzzle to be solved quickly or easily. This was something older, a machine that measured not just light, but memory, and it had been waiting. The logbooks were in the service room, stacked in a cabinet that smelled of mildew and old ink. Kai found them by the light of a dying flashlight, pages brittle and foxed. Each keeper had logged the dawn heading, a bearing measured from true north to the first flash of sun, corrected for refraction and the tower's magnetic declination. The entries marched backward through time, neat columns of numbers, sun symbols drawn in margins like tiny prayers. But the entries were incomplete. Gaps appeared, same as the ring, whole months missing, and in the margin of a 1901 page a different hand had written, "Purity achieved, array optimized, no scatter." Below it, a crude sketch of a prism with one edge shaved flat. Kai photographed the page with the phone. The camera shutter clicked. The image appeared in the gallery, and another photo, this one of a family trip to the tide pools, dissolved into pixels and was gone. Kai stared at the screen, throat tight. This was the cost Hale had meant. Every interaction with the lens, every attempt to correct its broken geometry, erased something, not randomly. The oldest photos tied to that moment's theme, sunsets first, then trips, then the candid, unguarded moments that made memory worth keeping. The radio crackled, Rin's voice faint through time or distance. Kai, if you can hear me, the charts are drifting. Harbour buoys are showing up in wrong positions. Old wrecks appearing on sonar where they shouldn't be. Something's wrong with the navigation. Kai keyed the mic. I'm working on it. Silence. Then, where are you? The lighthouse. Same place. You sound far away. Because I am, Kai thought but didn't say. Instead, I'll fix it. I promise. The lens above continued its rotation, indifferent to promises. The jumps became routine, if such a thing could ever be routine. Kai learned to read the rings, matching declinations to star tracks. Polaris for the recent past, its ring small and high. Sirius for deeper time, its track low and fast. Each sighting with the sextant was a calculation, an alignment of angle and memory, and each jump brought Kai to a different night in the lighthouse's long history. In 1968, Hale was younger, his coat less worn, his face still holding something like hope. He taught Kai how to read the keeper's tools, the bearing compass with its tiny bubble level, the way to sight a horizon through fog using the first pale ghost of dawn. In 1952, a different keeper entirely, a woman named Thorne, showed Kai the trick of carrying objects between nights. Hold it in the beam's core, she said, demonstrating with a brass fitting. When the ring passes, the light takes it with you, but only if you're steady. Flinch, and it stays behind. And in 1901, Kai met the lens right. He was bent over the lens housing, tools spread on a cloth, muttering to himself. Thin, ferret-faced, eyes too bright. When Kai climbed into the lantern room, the lens right barely looked up. You're out of phase, he said. I'm trying to fix the lens. Fix it? The lens right laughed, a sound like glass breaking. I've already fixed it, perfected it. Do you see? He gestured to the prisms where one facet gleamed flatter than the others, its edges too sharp. The scatter is gone. No impure light, no wasted photons, every ray true. You made the gap, Kai said. I made purity. The lenswright returned to his work, adjusting a set screw with fingers that trembled. The ring was messy before. Now it's clean, mathematically clean. The stars should thank me. Kai felt something cold settle in the chest. This man, this obsessive tinkerer, had shaved a prism to match his vision of perfection, and in doing so had cracked time itself. The gap in the ring was not an accident. It was a choice. And it had been warping navigation, warping memory, warping the coast's relationship to its own past for over a century. You have to undo it, Kai said. The lenswright didn't look up. Why would I undo perfection? There was no answer to that. Not one he would accept. Kai descended the ladder, leaving the lenswright to his tools and his certainty. Back in the service room, Kai opened the phone. Another photo gone. This one, a candid shot of Rin laughing at the harbour wall mid-sentence, caught in the light of a summer that felt impossibly distant now. Kai sat on the cold floor and let the grief come, sharp and clean as the lenswright's shaved prism. The storm worsened. Wind battered the tower, shaking the catwalk, rattling windows in their frames. The generator groaned, its rhythm uneven. Rin's voice on the radio grew fainter, punctuated by bursts of static that sounded almost like words but weren't. Kai jumped again, chasing the broken ring backward through its history, trying to find the moment before the lenswright's alteration. Each jump cost another photo, a sunset, a birthday. A quiet moment in the tide pools with Mom, her face turned toward the camera, smiling in a way she didn't smile anymore. That one hurt. Kai held the phone against the chest and breathed through it, the way Rin had taught once after a panic attack on the pier. In for 4, hold for 7, out for 8. The numbers were grounding, solid, something to count when the world refused to make sense. The lens turned, the ring spun, and in the gap, in the missing segment of light, Kai saw what had to be done. Not chasing backward, not trying to erase the lenswright's work, but correcting it. Setting the facet to the true angle, the one that matched the star track, the one that would close the ring and lock the present into place. It would cost more photos, maybe all of them. But the alternative was a coast time smeared, a harbour where wrecks appeared and disappeared, where buoys drifted off their charts, where memory itself became unreliable. Kai climbed to the lantern room and opened the keeper logs again, searching for the dawn tables. The refraction notes were there, but incomplete. The year of the present storm, the specific angle needed to correct for atmospheric bending, was missing. A blank space where a number should be. Hale appeared, crossing from a night Kai hadn't visited. He looked older than before, more weathered, as if the jumps were aging him too. You need the true heading, Hale said. Not a question. The tables are incomplete. Hale moved to the window, sighting along the glass toward where the horizon should be. There's a trick, not in any manual. I learned it from a keeper before me, who learned it from someone before him. You take the first flash on the eastern pane the moment the sun ghosts the fog. Apply a 2-finger offset on the sextant. It's crude, but it works. Poor man's correction. Show me, Hale demonstrated, holding his hand against the sextant scale, measuring the width of 2 fingers from a reference point. That's your refraction angle. Add it to the chart bearing, and you'll have the true dawn azimuth within 1/10 of a degree, close enough to lock the lens. How do you know it works? Hale met Kai's eyes. Because I've done this before. Not the same way. Not with the jumps. But I've had to relight the lens at dawn more times than I can count, and every time that offset holds. He paused. You'll need someone on the ground, though. Someone to give you a live horizon report. The fog's too thick up here. Kai keyed the radio. Rin, are you there? Static, then faint as breath. I'm here. I need you to watch the eastern horizon. Tell me the exact moment you see light. Even a ghost. Even a hint. Kai, what are you doing? Fixing the lens. A pause. Then, okay, I'll watch. The night stretched thin. Kai made one more jump, sighting the broken ring with precision, pulling the sextant angle from Hale's notes. The lantern room of 1901 materialised, the lenswright gone, his tools still laid out on the cloth. Kai moved quickly, unscrewing the misset prism, feeling its weight in trembling hands. It was heavier than it looked, dense as grief. To carry it forward, Kai had to time the beam's rotation, standing in the window as the core light swung around. The moment the white centre passed, Kai lifted the prism into it, holding steady, not flinching. The world lurched. The prism stayed solid, real, crossing from 1901 to the present in the palm of Kai's hands. Another photo vanished. The last one with Mum, her face in profile, looking at something off camera, forever lost now. Kai set the prism in the housing, aligning it with the star track visible through the fog. The facet clicked into place, and the broken ring shuddered, its gap narrowing, not closed yet, but closer. Dawn was minutes away. Kai climbed to the lens carriage, the mechanism that rotated the entire apparatus. It was old, brass and iron, powered by weights that descended through the tower like the guts of a clock. With Hale's 2-finger offset and Rin's horizon report, Kai calculated the true bearing. 93 degrees, corrected for refraction, magnetic declination, and the tower's own, drift over a century of storms. The radio crackled, Rin's voice clear for the first time in hours. "I see it. Eastern horizon. Lights ghosting the fog. Now." Kai spun the carriage wheel, aligning the lens to the calculated azimuth. The gears locked. The lens faced east toward the coming sun. "Relight," Kai whispered, more prayer than command. The mantle ignited. Not the electric bulb of modernity, but the old oil flame, fed by reserves Kai hadn't known still existed. The lens caught the light, fractured it, and threw it outward in a beam so bright the fog itself seemed to burn. The rings spun, all of them whole now, no gap, no broken segment, just the pure geometry of star tracks drawn by a light that had been corrected, set true, locked to the present. Outside, the fog brightened, not clearing, but solidifying, as if time itself was settling into place. The harbour boys Kai knew without seeing were returning to their charts, the wrecks fading back into the past where they belonged. The coast timeline, frayed and warped by the Lensright's obsession with purity, knitting itself back together. Kai sagged against the lens housing, exhausted as the first real rays of sun broke through. The beam held. The rings collapsed into a single honest line of light, cutting through fog, marking the coast, calling ships home. The radio crackled. Rin's voice filled with something that might have been relief or laughter or both. "Kai, I don't know what you did, but the charts just corrected themselves. Everything's back where it should be." "Good," Kai said, and meant it. Hale appeared one last time, not crossing from another night, but simply there, as if he had always been. He looked at the lens, at the beam, at Kai. "You did it." "I lost almost everything." "No," Hale said gently. "You gave it back. There's a difference." And then he was gone. Not vanishing, but simply not there anymore, as if he'd only existed in the gaps between corrected moments. Kai descended the tower slowly, legs shaking, body heavy with something that wasn't quite exhaustion. The service room, the iron spiral, the damp stone chambers. At the base, Rin was waiting, leaning against the tower wall, hands in pockets, hair damp with fog. "You look terrible," Rin said. "I feel terrible." "Want to tell me what happened?" Kai pulled out the phone, opened the gallery. It was thinner now, gaps where moments had lived. The pier sunset, the family trips, the candid shots that had made the phone feel full, but in the videos folder something new, a clip Kai didn't remember recording. The lens rings closing, spinning whole, and in the audio Rin's laugh from the radio, and beneath it, the sound of the beam cutting fog. At the end of the clip, a still frame. The lighthouse at dawn, its beam true, the coast behind it visible for the first time in days. Kai showed Rin the screen. "I had to fix the lens. It cost me most of my photos. But I think I saved the coast." Rin looked at the video, then at Kai. "You're serious." "I'm always serious." "I know, that's the problem." But Rin smiled, and it was the same smile from the deleted photo, the one Kai would never see again but would always remember. They walked back to the harbour together, the storm breaking apart overhead, shafts of sun piercing the fog in columns that looked almost like light rings if you squinted. At the harbour wall, Rin paused. "What are you going to do now?" Kai looked at the phone, at the thinned gallery, at the new video that held the only proof of what had happened. "I'm going to print that last frame, tape it inside the lantern room door, so the next person who climbs the tower knows the lens was set right. And then?" And then I'm going to remember everything the photos can't show me. The way Mum looked at me when I was afraid. The way the pier sunset felt, not just looked. The way you laughed that day on the wall. Kai met Rin's eyes. Memories more than pictures. I think I understand that now. Rin nodded, and they stood there. 2 16-year-olds on a coast that had been time-smeared and wasn't anymore, as the fog finally began to lift. That night, Kai returned to the lighthouse one more time, carrying a printed photograph in a plastic sleeve. The climb was easier now, familiar, the iron steps and spiral known. In the lantern room, the lens rotated smoothly, its gears clicking with the precision of something repaired. The beam swung out over a darkening sea, solid and whole, no rings visible in the clear air. Kai taped the photograph inside the door, where generations of keepers had left their own marks. Names, dates, sun symbols, and now this, a single frame of a lighthouse at dawn, its beam cutting true. On the back, in careful handwriting, Kai wrote, "The lens was broken. The lens is fixed. If you see rings in the fog, measure carefully. Every correction costs something, but some things are worth the price. Below it, smaller. Relight at true dawn. The stars will thank you." Kai stood at the window, looking out at the coast, at the harbour lights steady in their positions, at the buoys that no longer drifted. The phone was in one pocket, lighter than before. The sextant was in the other, still solid, still precise. In the keeper logs, a new name had appeared on the plaque mounted by the hatch. Not Kai's name, Hale's. As if he had always been there, would always be there, watching the light through the long nights and the longer years. The lens turned, the beam swept, and Kai descended into the tower, into the world, carrying fewer photos but more memory than before, knowing that some things cannot be captured, only lived, only kept in the careful geometry of what we choose to hold when the light swings past and the rings begin to spin. The foghorn sounded low and steady, calling through the dark. Rin's voice crackled on the radio, asking if everything was all right. Kai keyed the mic, said yes, and meant it. The storm had passed. The coast was settled. And somewhere in the thinned gallery of a phone that had seen too much, a video played on loop, rings closing, light-cutting fog, and the sound of laughter echoing through the static. Proof that some moments, once lived, could never truly be erased. 3 weeks later, Kai returned to the lighthouse with Rin, not because the lens needed attention, or because fog had rolled in thick enough to paint rings, because Rin had asked quietly to see the place where Kai had spent that long night fixing something neither of them fully understood. They climbed together this time, Rin moving slower on the iron steps, pausing to run fingers along the stone walls where moisture had drawn maps of minerals and time. In the service room, Kai showed the logbooks, the columns of dawn headings, the sun symbols in margins. Rin traced one with a fingertip, not speaking, just feeling the weight of all those mornings when someone had stood in the lantern room and calculated the world back into alignment. "It's strange," Rin said finally, knowing the light does more than just warn ships, that it measures something deeper. "Time," Kai said. "Memory. Both, maybe. Or neither. Maybe it just shows us what we're willing to lose to set things right." They climbed to the lantern room. The lens hung motionless now, its rotation mechanism stilled during daylight hours. But even still, even silent, it commanded the space. Light streamed through the windows, caught the prisms, and threw a dozen soft rainbows across the floor. Kai moved to the photograph taped inside the door, checking that it still held. The tape was already yellowing at the edges, aging faster than it should, as if the tower itself was claiming the image, pulling it into history. Rin read the inscription on the back. Did Hale really exist? Or was he just part of the lens, something the light conjured up to help you? "I don't know," Kai admitted. "His name's on the plaque now, but I looked him up. There's no record of a Keeper Hale in the official logs. No birth certificate, no death notice, nothing. Maybe he was like the Lenswright, someone who got stuck in the gaps and learned to navigate them. Maybe." Kai touched the lens housing, feeling its coolness. Or maybe the lighthouse needed a guide, and he was what it made. They stood quietly, watching dust motes spiral through the rainbow light. Outside, the coast stretched away in both directions, clear and bright, the kind of day sailors prayed for. No fog, no storm, just clean horizons and water that sparkled like hammered metal. Rin pulled something from a jacket pocket, A small spiral notebook, its cover water-stained and soft. I've been keeping a log since that night. Not like the keeper logs, with bearings and headings, just notes. Things I remember about the harbour before the charts went wrong. Buoy positions, wreck locations, the way the tide ran through the breakwater. Why? Because you're not the only one who lost something. Rin, open the notebook, showing pages filled with careful handwriting, small sketches of the harbour's geography. I had memories too, of the coast before it got time smeared, and when you fixed the lens, some of those memories changed. Not erased, not like your photos, but shifted. Like I'm remembering two versions of the same place now, and I can't always tell which one is real. Kai took the notebook, flipping through pages. Rin had drawn the harbour from memory, marking every mooring, every channel marker, every shoal. But in the margins, in different coloured ink were alternate versions, buoys that existed in one timeline but not another, wrecks that appeared and disappeared depending on which history you followed. "You're keeping both," Kai said. "I'm trying to. I figure if the lighthouse can hold multiple nights in its lens, maybe I can hold multiple versions of the coast in my head." Rin smiled, but it was tired. "It's exhausting, though. Like carrying extra weight you can't put down." Kai handed back the notebook. "I'm sorry. I didn't know the fix would do that." "Don't be. You saved the coast. That matters more than my confused memories." Rin tucked the notebook away. "Besides, I think it's useful, having someone who remembers both versions in case it happens again." "You think it will?" "I think the lens is old, and old things break. Maybe not in our lifetime. Maybe not for 100 years, but eventually someone else will stand in this room, sight a gap in the rings, and have to make the same choice you did." Rin moved to the window, looking down at the harbour far below. "And when they do, they'll see your photograph. They'll read your warning, and maybe they'll understand what the cost really is before they start." Kai joined Rin at the window. From this height, the harbour looked toy-like, boats small as fingernails, the breakwater a thin line of white against blue. It was strange to think that place had been warped, its geography unstable, its history bleeding through itself like watercolours left in rain. Stranger still to know that fixing it had required sacrificing the very tools Kai had used to anchor memory. "Do you regret it?" Rin asked. "Losing the photos?" "Every day," Kai said, "but I'd do it again." "That's either very brave or very stupid." "Can't it be both?" Rin laughed, the sound echoing in the lantern room, bouncing off glass and brass and crystal. It was the same laugh Kai had heard through the radio that dawn, the one that had been captured in the video, the one that proved some things survive even when their images don't. They descended together, moving through the tower's spiral, through its chambers and levels, through the accumulated weight of all the years it had stood against storms. At the base, they found something neither had noticed on the way up, a small brass plaque mounted near the door, newer than the others, its surface bright and unscarred. The plaque read, "In memory of those who tend the light, past, present and yet to come, may you know when to hold fast and when to let go." Below it 3 initials, KH. Kai stared. "That wasn't here before? Are you sure?" "I've been up and down this tower a dozen times. I would have seen it." Rin touched the plaque, tracing the initials. Maybe the tower's still settling, still figuring out what history to keep. A pause. Or maybe someone else made a jump, fixed something we didn't notice, left their own mark. The thought was unsettling and comforting in equal measure, that the lighthouse might be a place where time was always slightly fluid, where past and present and future brushed against each other like the rings of a light in fog. That Kai's fix had held, but not perfectly, not completely. That there would always be small gaps, small moments when the geometry slipped and someone, somewhere, would need to climb the tower and measure the stars. They walked back to the harbour in silence, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. At the breakwater, Rin pulled out a radio handset, checking the frequency. "I've been thinking about starting a log on the air. Nothing official, just a nightly check-in. Harbour conditions, weather, that kind of thing." "Why?" "Because if the coast gets time smeared again, someone needs to be keeping track of what's normal, what's supposed to be there. You had the photos to tell you what you were losing. Next time, maybe someone needs a voice on the radio telling them what to hold on to." Kai understood. Memory took different forms. Pictures, notebooks, voices in the static. All of them ways to measure what mattered, what was worth the cost of keeping. "I'll listen in," Kai said. Every night. Good. Rin keyed the mic, testing. This is Harbour Station, WX9 Rin, broadcasting on the emergency band. All ships, all stations, this is a time check and condition report. If you're out there, if you're listening, know that the coast is steady, the charts are true, the light is burning, and someone is watching. The words drifted out over the water, caught by antennas and receivers, heard by sailors and Coast Guard and anyone with a radio tuned to the right frequency. Kai thought about all the other messages that had travelled this coast over the years. Distress calls and weather reports and casual chatter, all of them threading through the air like invisible light, connecting points across distance and time. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the water in shades of copper and gold. In an hour the lighthouse beam would ignite, rotating through the clear air, visible for miles. No rings tonight, no gaps. Just honest light doing the work it was built for. Kai pulled out the phone, opened the video one more time, watched the rings close, heard the laughter, saw the still frame of dawn breaking over a coast that had been saved by someone willing to lose what they loved most. The gallery was thin now, yes, but the video remained, and in remaining it proved something important, that even in losing, something essential could be kept. That memory lived not just in images, but in the spaces between them, in the choices made when the light swung past and demanded its price. "Thank you," Kai said to Rin, "for watching that morning, for giving me the horizon report. I couldn't have done it without you." Rin smiled. "That's what we do, isn't it? Watch for each other. Call out when we see light breaking through." They sat on the breakwater as the sun dropped lower, as the lighthouse beam began its rotation, as the coast settled into evening. And when Rin started the nightly broadcast, Kai listened, hearing in that steady voice the same thing the lighthouse beam carried, a promise that someone was keeping watch, that the geometry held, that dawn would come again with its true heading intact. Some nights, when fog rolled in thick enough, Kai climbed the tower alone and watched the rings appear. They were whole now, unbroken, painting their perfect circles onto the white. But sometimes, just at the edge of vision, Kai thought there might be the ghost of a gap, a shadow where light should be, a reminder that nothing stays fixed forever, that time is always moving, always wearing away at the edges of what we think we've repaired. But for now, the lens turned true, the coast held steady, and somewhere in the thinned gallery of a phone that had paid the price, a video played on loop, proof that some lights, once set right, burned honest enough to guide ships home through any fog, through any night. Through all the years, the tower would stand and watch and measure the patient mathematics of stars. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The clocks in Milford had begun forgetting themselves. Not all at once. Such things never announce themselves with thunder. It was subtle, a slippage. The bank's tower chimed 11 when noon had only just arrived. Mrs. Kellerman's cuckoo fell silent mid-song. The radiators in the high school science wing coughed and went cold, though the furnace still burned below. No one spoke of it directly, but everyone felt the chill creeping into ordinary things. Coffee cooled too quickly in its cup. Breath misted less in the frozen air. Even laughter seemed thinner, as if winter itself had learned to steal warmth without asking. Mira Bishop noticed because she kept time differently than most. At 16, she measured her days not in hours but in the arc of blades across ice, in the number of times her grandmother's brass storm lantern needed trimming, in the distance between stars. She had skated frozen hourglass lake since childhood, long before its name made sense to anyone but the oldest families. Her grandmother had taught her on these same black glass surfaces, holding her mittened hands while the lantern swung from a pole driven into the shore. The lake earned its name from its shape, 2 wide basins connected by a narrow throat, perfect symmetry when seen from the ridge above, like an hourglass laid flat and filled with winter. But Grandma was gone now, 2 winters buried, and Mira skated alone. The night she found the hourglass beneath the ice, the wind had died completely. Such stillness was rare on the lake. Usually the air moved restlessly across the frozen surface, carrying voices from the far shore or the grinding complaint of ice expanding in the cold. But that night nothing stirred. Mira had brought the lantern without quite knowing why. Her mother said it was time to pack away Grandma's things, to let the past rest. But the storm lantern felt alive in her hands, its brass warm even in the cold, its reservoir still holding a thumb's worth of oil that never seemed to burn down. She laced her skates at the eastern shore and pushed off into the dark. The ice here was glass clear, frozen during a windless cold snap that left the surface smooth as poured resin. Beneath her blades she could see down through layers of transparent crystal to the lake bed 20 feet below, and there, impossible and enormous, lay an hourglass. Mira stopped so abruptly her blade sent up a spray of ice shavings that hung suspended in the still air. She crouched, pressing her gloved hand flat against the frozen surface, and stared. The hourglass was buried in the silt and stone at the bottom of the lake, but its upper chamber rose nearly to the ice itself. It must have been 12 feet tall, its glass bulbs thick and ancient, bound with bands of dark metal that had gone green with age, and inside sand was falling. Not ordinary sand. This glowed faintly, a pale mint-green luminescence that pulsed with each grain that dropped from the upper chamber to the lower. The fall was slow, hypnotic, each particle drifting down through the narrow neck like a tiny star descending. Mira's breath caught. She had skated this lake 1,000 times and never seen anything beneath the ice but stones and the occasional sunken log. Yet here was something that looked older than the town itself, older than memory, steadily counting down towards some conclusion she could not name. She raised the lantern without thinking, holding it high to see better. The flame inside was small but steady, fed by that strange oil that never diminished. Its light spilled across the ice, golden and warm, and that was when she saw the sky. The lake's surface was so clear, so perfectly still, that it reflected the heavens with absolute fidelity. She could see every star, every distant flicker of light, mirrored in the black glass beneath her feet. The constellations hung both above and below, and she stood suspended between them. But something was wrong. Mira knew the winter sky. Her grandmother had taught her the names: Cassiopeia's crooked throne, Orion's belt, the trailing sisters of the Pleiades. She knew them the way she knew the feel of ice beneath her blades, by instinct and long practice. And in the reflection below, one star was missing. There, in the northern quadrant of the mirrored heavens, a gap. Not a space between stars, but an absence where light should have been. A hole in the pattern, as if someone had reached down and plucked a single bright point from the constellation's design. She looked up. The star was there in the actual sky, burning steady and cold. But in the ice's reflection, only darkness. Mira held the lantern lower, bringing its flame closer to the missing spot. The golden light touched the ice, and the star appeared, not in reflection. The lantern's glow somehow completed the constellation, filling the gap with warm radiance that spread like liquid across the frozen surface. The light pooled in the empty space, bright and steady, and suddenly Mira could see a thin line of luminescence running from the completed star down through the ice, threading toward the buried hourglass like a plumb line dropped from heaven. The ice beneath her skates groaned softly, not breaking, shifting, as if something deep below had stirred and found the surface wanting. She should have pulled back, should have skated for shore and left this strangeness to the dark. But Grandma's voice surfaced in her memory, warm as the lantern in her hands. When the ice speaks, you listen. It knows what the wind forgets. So Mira knelt and set the lantern directly over the missing star's reflection. The flame burned brighter, fed by something she couldn't name. And there, at the very edge of the light's reach, she saw them. Grains of sand. They lay scattered on the ice like salt, dozens of tiny fragments that glowed the same faint mint as the sand falling in the buried hourglass. They must have been there all along, invisible, until the lantern's light touched them. Now they shimmered, alive with inner radiance. Mira picked one up. It was warm between her gloved fingers, warmer than anything should be in winter's heart. On impulse, or perhaps guided by the same instinct that had brought her here, she unscrewed the lantern's reservoir cap and dropped the grain inside. The oil flared green. The flame shot up, brilliant and cold and impossibly bright. The light no longer looked like fire. It burned with the colour of distant stars, of ice lit from within, of time itself made visible. The completed constellation blazed in the ice below, and the thread of light connecting it to the buried hourglass grew thick as rope, solid as an anchor chain. The ice opened, not with a crack or a breaking. The surface simply lensed, bending like a piece of curved glass, and Mira fell through into elsewhere. She landed hard on frozen lake, blades striking ice with a sound like a bell being struck underwater. The impact jarred her teeth and sent the lantern tumbling from her grip. It skittered across the surface, flames somehow still burning, trailing a line of green-gold light. Mira scrambled to her knees, breathing hard. The lake. It was the lake. Still frozen hourglass. Still the same doubled basins and narrow throat. But everything else had changed. Music drifted across the ice. Not the silence of the winter she'd left, but accordion and fiddle, laughter and voices raised in song. Lights blazed on the western shore, torches and strings of bulbs. The warm glow of a carnival spread across the snow. She stared. The eastern shore, where she'd entered the ice, showed no lights, no town at all, just dark trees and virgin snow, and a sky full of stars that looked both familiar and wrong, their position shifted by some subtle degree she couldn't quite name. When, she thought, not where. Somehow she'd fallen not just through ice, but through time itself. The lantern lay a few yards away, still burning with that strange green-tinged flame. Mira crawled toward it on hands and knees, afraid to stand, afraid the ice might open again and swallow her deeper. When her fingers closed around the brass handle, warmth flooded through her. Not just heat, but something more fundamental. Relief, recognition, anchor. She looked down. The hourglass was still there, visible through the clear ice, but its position had changed. The sand level sat higher in the upper chamber, as if she were seeing it earlier in its long, slow emptying. "You all right, miss?" Mira spun. A boy stood at the edge of the light, maybe 17, wearing a wool coat that hung to his knees and a cap pulled low over his ears. He carried a thermos in one hand and concern on his face. Yes, I slipped." The lie came automatically, though her blades had left no mark on the ice between here and nowhere. "Long way from the fair to slip," he observed, but offered his hand anyway. "Name's Tommy. You come from the ridge?" She let him pull her, upright, legs shaking, and realised the music had stopped. People were looking their way, dozens of them, carnival goers in old-fashioned clothes, their breath pluming white in the lantern light. Old-fashioned. The realisation settled cold in her chest. The bulbs strung between poles were the old Edison kind, and the accordion player wore sleeve garters, and not a single person held a phone or wore modern boots. What year is it? The question escaped before she could stop it. Tommy's eyebrows rose. "Hit your head too, it's 79, January of 79. He studied her more closely, taking in her modern parka and the LED bright trim on her ice skates. "You from the college? Some kind of art project?" 1979, 40-some years before she was born. Mira felt the lake tilt beneath her, though the ice remained flat and true. "I need to go," she managed, and turned away before he could ask more questions. The lantern felt heavier now, its flame burning steadily but wrong, fed by that single grain of time sand she'd dropped into its reservoir. She could feel it pulling at something inside her. Not pain exactly, but a kind of cold that started in her chest and spread outward, as if winter had learned to burn. She skated hard for the eastern shore, for the place where she'd fallen through. Behind her, Tommy called something, but the words didn't reach her. The accordion started up again, and laughter rippled across the carnival ice, and Mira fled toward darkness. When she reached the spot, she knew it by the position of the stars, by the way the hourglass lined up beneath her. She raised the lantern high and held it over that missing reflection. Nothing happened. She shook the lantern, tilted it, brought it so close to the ice that the flame nearly touched the surface. The light blazed green, painful to look at, but the ice remained solid beneath her. Trapped. She was trapped 40-some years before her own birth, and the cold inside her chest was spreading, numbing her fingers, making her thoughts slow and thick. "Count the flickers," Grandma's voice whispered. Not a memory. Something older, rising from the lantern itself as if the brass held more than oil and flame. "Count the flickers, and you'll know how far you've gone." Mira stilled herself and watched the flame. It didn't burn steady. The green-tinged fire pulsed, a subtle rhythm she'd missed in her panic. She counted under her breath, watching the light brighten and dim, brighten and dim. 43 flickers since she'd dropped in the sand and fallen through. 43 years. The ice opened. This time Mira didn't fall so much as rise, the surface bending upward to release her into her own winter. She tumbled onto frozen lake and lay gasping, the lantern clutched to her chest. The carnival was gone, the silence had returned, and the cold inside her. The cold remained. She made it to shore before her legs gave out, collapsed in the snow beside the path, shivering so hard her teeth clacked, together. When she tried to stand, dizziness spun the world sideways. Wrong. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Mira looked at her hands in the lantern light. They appeared unchanged. Same gloves, same fingers, same chipped blue nail polish from last week. But they felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. And when she breathed, her frosted breath looked thinner than it should, barely visible against the dark. The walk home took twice as long as it should have. She kept having to stop, leaning against trees, waiting for strength to return. The streets of Milford were empty at this hour, but lights burned in windows, and somewhere a dog barked its nighttime complaint. Normal. Everything looked normal. But when she passed the bank, its tower clock showed 11:47. She knew. She'd left the lake at midnight. She'd checked her phone at 11:53 before lacing up her skates. Time had slipped while she was gone. 6 minutes. Stolen from the world. She made it to her house and stumbled through the kitchen door to find her mother standing at the stove, stirring something that smelled of chocolate and vanilla, hot cocoa, their winter tradition. There you are. Mum looked up with a smile that faded when she saw Mira's face. Honey, you look frozen through. Come here. She wrapped Mira in a blanket and pressed a mug into her shaking hands. The cocoa should have been perfect, always was. Her mother's specialty, thick with cream and a hint of cinnamon. But when Mira sipped, it tasted flat. Not bad, just less, as if all the warmth had been leached away, leaving only brown liquid and heat. Good? Her mother asked. Perfect, Mira lied, and drank it anyway, hoping to stop the shivering. But the cold had settled too deep. It lived in her bones now, a chill no blanket or beverage could touch. She carried it upstairs to her room and sat at her desk by the window, still wrapped in wool, and stared at Grandma's lantern. The flame had returned to its normal golden colour. The reservoir held the same thumb's worth of oil it always did. But when she looked closely, she could see something else suspended in the liquid. A single grain of mint-green sand glowing faintly. Time sand. Stolen from the buried hourglass, carried through 43 years, and now burning slowly in the lantern's heart. Mira picked up her phone to text Jonah. Stopped. Stared at the screen. 11:54. She'd been home 10 minutes. The clock should read past midnight. But time had slipped again, rolling backward, erasing the moments she'd spent walking, as if the world itself was forgetting. Her fingers shook as she typed. Come to the lake tomorrow after school. Something's wrong with the ice. The response came almost immediately. Jonah kept odd hours, tinkering in his garage workshop until late, building telescopes and tracking star drift for reasons only he fully understood. Wrong how? She looked at the lantern, at the glowing grain suspended in oil, at the way her bedroom window showed only darkness where the clock tower's lit face should be visible. I jumped, she typed, and something came back with me. A long pause. Then I'll bring my charts. Mira set down the phone and pulled the blanket tighter. Outside, Milford's few streetlights flickered and dimmed. In the distance, someone's radiator clanked and fell silent. And somewhere beneath frozen Hourglass Lake, sand continued falling through the neck of an impossible hourglass, counting down toward a midnight no one else could see coming. She closed her eyes and tried to remember warmth. Grandma's hands teaching her to skate, summer sun on the lake's unfrozen surface, the weight of a good laugh shared with friends. But the memories felt distant now, faded at the edges, as if the cold spreading through her had learned to steal more than just heat. Jonah arrived at the lake's eastern shore the next day carrying what looked like half his workshop in a canvas pack. Telescope tubes stuck out at odd angles, notebooks threatened to spill from side pockets, and something metallic clinked with each step. You look terrible, he said by way of greeting, setting down the pack with a grunt. Hello to you too. But Mira knew he was right. She'd checked the mirror that morning. Her lips had gone pale and shadows smudged beneath her eyes. The cold from last night's jump had settled deeper, making her movements slow and her thoughts sluggish. Even now, standing in the weak January sun, she couldn't stop shivering. Jonah studied her with the same careful attention he usually reserved for star charts and broken machinery. He'd been her friend since middle school, when they'd been paired for a science project neither of them wanted. He'd shown up with a homemade spectroscope and a theory about light that the teacher said was too advanced for 8th grade. Mira had asked why he cared what teachers thought, and they'd been inseparable since. "Show me," he said. She led him onto the ice. The lake looked ordinary in daylight. Just frozen water, snow-dusted and crossed with the scratches of previous skaters. But when they reached the throat, that narrow passage between the two basins, Jonah stopped and stared. "Is that an hourglass?" "Yes." Even in daylight you could see it if you looked carefully. The upper chamber rising from the lake bed, the sand glowing faintly mint green, the slow inevitable fall from one bulb to the other. Impossible to miss once you knew to look. Jonah crouched, pressing both hands flat against the ice. "How long has this been here?" "I don't know. Forever, maybe. Or it just appeared." Mira crouched beside him, the lantern heavy in her hands. But that's not the strangest part. She told him about the missing star, the sand scattered on the ice, the way the lantern's flame had completed the constellation, about falling through into 1979, into a winter carnival that had ended decades before either of them were born, about counting the flame's flickers and rising back into their own time, and about the cold, the way it had taken root inside her, the flat taste of cocoa, the thinning of her breath, the sense that something fundamental had been carved away and not returned. Jonah listened without interrupting, a rare gift in a world that favoured quick reactions over slow thought. When she finished, he sat back on his heels and looked at the sky. "Show me the star," he said quietly. That night they returned together. Jonah brought his telescope and 3 different star charts, each marked with his careful annotations. Mira brought the lantern and a thermos of coffee she couldn't taste but drank anyway, hoping the ritual might restore something memory couldn't. The missing star's reflection appeared exactly as before, a gap in the perfect mirror of the ice, a hole where light should be. Jonah spent 20 minutes with his telescope, checking and rechecking the actual sky, muttering equations under his breath. "It's there," he finally announced. "In the real sky, I mean. That's Polaris Gamma, part of the Little Bear's tail. Unremarkable star, about 450 light-years out." He looked down at the ice, at the empty space in the reflection. "But down here, it's gone." "Why?" Mira asked, though she suspected there were no good answers to questions like that. "I don't know, but I can tell you this." He pulled out a worn notebook, flipped to a page covered in calculations. "I've been tracking stellar drift for my thesis project, mapping how stars appear to move over time, building a kind of temporal map. And if your flicker count theory is right, if each pulse of that flame equals 1 year of travel," he trailed off, chewing his bottom lip the way he did when mathematics turned into prophecy. "What? I think the hourglass is a clock, not just marking time, but holding it, and every grain that falls moves the world forward by some increment, but someone's been stealing the sand." Mira felt the weight of the lantern in her hands. "The grain I dropped in shouldn't exist in 2 places at once. By taking it, you created a paradox. Time in the hourglass, time in the lantern. The world can't decide which is real, so it's starting to drift." He gestured at the ice, at the buried timepiece below. "That's why the clocks are slipping. That's why things feel cold. The hourglass is trying to correct the imbalance by drawing heat from everything around it. Energy has to come from somewhere. How do I fix it?" Jonah shook his head slowly. "I'm not sure you can. Not alone. You'd need to return all the stolen sand, restore the missing star, and somehow reset the count." He paused. "And Mira? That grain you took? It's not the only one missing. Look." He swept his flashlight across the ice. Now that Mira knew to look, she could see them. Dozens of mint-green grains scattered across the frozen surface. More than she'd noticed that first night. They glittered in the beam like salt, like stars fallen to earth. "Someone else has been taking sand," Jonah said quietly. "A lot of it. and every piece they take steals more warmth from the world. As if summoned by his words, the air grew suddenly colder. Not the normal bite of winter, but something deeper, more absolute. Their breath stopped misting. The stars overhead flickered and steadied, their light uncertain. And across the lake, through the darkness, something moved. A figure, tall and still, standing at the western shore, watching them. Mira raised the lantern instinctively, bringing its light up between them and the distant shape. The flame burned bright and gold, and for a moment she saw him clearly. A man in a long coat, his face hidden by shadow, his hands clutching something that clinked like glass. Then the light flared green, the missing star blazed in the ice below, and the world tilted sideways. No! Mira tried to pull back, but it was too late. The ice had already begun to lens. Grab on! Jonah's hand found her arm just as the surface opened, and they fell together into another winter, another year, the lantern's flame burning cold and bright as they tumbled through time. They landed in darkness so complete Mira thought for a moment she'd gone blind. No carnival lights this time, no music or laughter. Just cold and the sound of wind that wasn't quite wind, more like the world breathing in its sleep. The lantern had gone out. Mira shook it, heard the oil sloshing, felt the warm weight of it in her hands, but the flame had died in the fall, leaving them in blackness so thick it had texture, weight, presence. "Jonah," she whispered. "Here." His voice came from her left, close enough to touch. His hand found hers in the dark, fingers cold. "Where are we?" "I don't know. Let me." She fumbled with the lantern, trying to relight it with numb fingers. The matches in her pocket were damp with melted snow, and the first three refused to catch. The fourth flared briefly, casting wild shadows across ice that looked wrong, textured differently, older somehow. The match burned down to her fingers and died. In that last instant of light she'd seen something carved into the ice. Lines, deliberate marks, a figure eight cut deep into the frozen surface, its loops wide and perfect. The fifth match caught, and she managed to get the lantern's wick burning. The flame rose golden and steady, pushing back the darkness to reveal a winter unlike any she'd seen. They stood on frozen hourglass lake, but the ice here was ancient, thick and ridged and scarred with the marks of centuries. No town lights burned on the shore, no houses at all, just forest, dense and primordial, trees so tall their tops vanished into the night. And the hourglass beneath their feet. The sand sat nearly full in the upper chamber. Almost no grains had fallen yet. They were seeing the clock at its beginning, or near enough. How far back had they jumped? Jonah was staring at the figure eight carved into the ice. "Someone's been here," he said. "Recently. Look at the cuts. They're clean, not weathered." Mira brought the lantern closer. He was right. The grooves looked fresh, the ice around them still showing the pale colour of new-cut crystal. But there were no tracks, no sign of who had carved them or why. The wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that made Mira's skin prickle. Not quite a voice, not quite music, something in between, rising and falling like breath, like sorrow, like longing. "We need to count the flickers," she said. "Figure out how far we've come." But Jonah wasn't listening. He'd turned toward the western shore, toward the dark wall of trees. "Something's out there," he whispered. The figure emerged from the forest slowly, as if reluctant to leave the shadows. The same man they'd seen across the ice in their own time, but closer now. Close enough to see the frost that clung to his coat, the way his breath didn't fog the air, the strange stillness about him that suggested he'd been cold for so long, he'd forgotten what warmth felt like. He carried bottles, glass bottles of all sizes and shapes, clutched against his chest and clinking softly with each step. And inside them, glowing mint green, were grains of time sand. Hundreds of them. "Stay back," Mira said, raising the lantern like a weapon. The man stopped at the edge of the light. Up close she could see his face, weathered and worn, eyes that held too much sorrow to be easily measured. He looked old and young at once, as if time had lost its meaning for him. "You shouldn't be here," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, shaped by silence and cold. "This winter isn't yours." "Neither is yours," Jonah said. "Not any more. You've been stealing from the hourglass." The man's grip tightened on his bottles. Not stealing, saving. Each grain is a moment I'm preserving. Perfect moments before everything went wrong. He looked past them, toward the eastern shore, though nothing stood there but trees. Before the fire, before she died. Mira felt something shift in her chest. Not just cold now, but recognition. "Who are you?" "I kept the lighthouse," he said, "before the town grew, before they paved the shore and built their houses. Just me and Elizabeth and the light. We used to skate here in winter. She taught me the figure 8, said it was the symbol of forever." His voice cracked. "Then the lamp oil caught fire, and the lighthouse burned, and she never left. A lighthouse keeper?" Mira tried to remember if she'd ever heard of a lighthouse on the lake. "Came up empty. How long have you been here?" He looked at her with eyes like winter itself. "I don't know anymore. I started taking sand to go back, to the night before the fire, to warn her, to save her. But every time I jumped, she still died. The fire always happened, no matter what I changed. So I stopped trying to change it. I just started collecting the moments before. Perfect moments, frozen in time." He held up the bottles so the lantern light caught the glowing sand inside. "I have enough now to stay in one forever." The ice beneath them groaned, and Mira felt warmth bleed from her hands into the lantern. The world was correcting itself, drawing heat to compensate for the stolen time. "You can't," she said. "Every grain you take steals from the present, from everyone. The town is freezing. People are losing warmth, losing minutes, losing memories. Better they lose minutes than I lose her," the ice warden said. "That's what Elizabeth called me. Her warden against the dark. I kept the light burning so ships wouldn't founder. Now I keep her light burning in the past." He took a step forward. "Give me your lantern. It's stronger than mine. With it, I can seal the missing star forever. Lock one perfect winter in place and let the world spin on without me." Jonah moved between them. "That's not how time works. You seal the star, you stop the hourglass. Everything stops. No more winters, no more springs. Just one moment, frozen forever, draining the warmth from everything that comes after. Then everyone will understand," the warden said quietly. "They'll know what it means to lose the thing that kept them warm." He reached out, fast as striking ice, and his hand passed through the lantern's light. For an instant his fingers looked solid, real. Then the light flared, the missing star blazed beneath their feet, and Mira saw the truth. He wasn't just a man trapped by grief. He was part of the lake's magic now, woven into the hourglass's mechanism. Every grain of sand he stole bound him tighter to the frozen moments he hoarded. He'd become a ghost of his own making, sustained by stolen time and unable to move forward. Mira pulled the lantern back, but not before the warden's fingers brushed the brass. The touch sent ice straight through her, colder than any winter, and with it came a flood of memories that weren't hers. Elizabeth's laugh as they skated figure 8s in moonlight, the smell of lamp oil and sea wind, the moment he saw smoke rising from the lighthouse tower, her face in the window trapped by flame, his failure to reach her, and underneath it all the terrible realization that he'd been stealing sand for so long he couldn't remember what warmth felt like, couldn't remember the sound of her voice, couldn't remember anything but the outline of loss itself. Mira gasped and stumbled backward. Jonah caught her, and the three of them stood frozen in a tableau of light and shadow, the warden with his bottles, the teenagers with their lantern, and between them the buried hourglass counting down toward a midnight that might never come. "I'm sorry," Mira said. The words felt small and insufficient, but they were all she had. "I'm sorry for what you lost, but you have to let her go. You have to let the sand fall." The warden looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back toward the trees, bottles clinking softly, his footsteps leaving no mark on the ice. When he reached the forest edge, he stopped. "You'll understand soon enough," he called back. "The hourglass takes everything eventually. Time, warmth, memory, all of it falls through the neck and vanishes below. I'm just trying to save what matters before it's gone." Then he vanished into shadow, and the wind rose again, carrying that not-quite voice across the frozen lake. Mira looked down at the lantern. The flame still burned, but dimmer now. The grain of time sand glowed faintly in the reservoir, and she could feel it pulling at her, stealing warmth with every moment it stayed lit. "We need to go back," she said. Figure out how to stop him before he seals the star. Jonah was staring at the carved figure 8. I don't think we can stop him, he said slowly. Not by force. But maybe, he knelt, tracing the lines with one finger. Maybe we can show him there's another way. Look at this. It's not just any figure 8. It's a lemniscate, the symbol of infinity. And see how it's positioned, right over the neck of the hourglass. What does that mean? I think it's a reset mechanism, a way to flip the hourglass without sealing the star, but it requires skating the pattern at a specific time, midnight stillness when the world holds its breath, the moment between one day and the next. Mira remembered that feeling, the suspension of all motion, when wind died and snow hung in the air and even thoughts seemed to slow. It came rarely, and never for long. How do we know when? She asked. We don't. But if we're going to try, we need to do it in our own time, and we need to collect all the sand the warden's stolen, return it to the hourglass before we attempt the flip. Mira looked at the flame, at the way it pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. Count the flickers, she said. Let's go home. They counted together this time, watching the green-tinged fire brighten and dim. Each pulse felt like a year sliding past, like time rushing backward toward the present. Mira lost count somewhere past 500, but Jonah kept going, his lips moving silently, his eyes fixed on the flame. When the ice finally lensed and released them, they tumbled back into their own winter with a jolt that knocked the breath from their lungs. The lantern stayed lit, but barely. The flame guttered and smoked, fed by that single stolen grain. They lay on the ice, gasping, while the cold inside Mira spread deeper. She could feel it in her bones now, in the spaces between thoughts. Memories were growing hazy. Summer afternoons, her father's face, the taste of birthday cake. All fading, leached away by the paradox of existing in 2 times at once. Jonah pulled her to her feet. We don't have much time, he said. The town's losing more than minutes now. People are forgetting things, warm things, the things that make winter bearable. How do we find the warden's bottles? He looked across the lake toward the place where the figure had stood watching them. We jump again, but this time we go prepared. We catch the bottles in the ice's reflection and pull them through. Objects can cross eras when the lantern's light overlaps their reflection. It took 3 more jumps, 3 more winters stolen from the hourglass, 3 more pieces of warmth carved from Mira's core. They found bottles scattered across decades, one in 1963, frozen in ice during a freak cold snap. Another in 2012, buried in snow near the old lighthouse foundation. A third in 1941, clutched in the hands of a statue the warden had made from ice and grief. Each time they returned a bottle, Mira felt a little less solid, a little less real. Her reflection in the ice was fading, growing transparent, as if the world was starting to forget she existed. On the 4th jump, they encountered the warden again. He stood in the middle of 1987, surrounded by bottles arranged in careful patterns, constellations of stolen time, glowing green in the darkness. You can't have them, he said. These are mine, my moments, my memories, my wife. She's gone, Mira said. Her voice came out thin and distant, as if she were speaking from very far away. You can't bring her back by stopping time. You're just making everyone else lose what you've already lost. Better that than moving forward, the warden said. Better that than admitting she's gone. He knelt and pressed both hands against the ice, and the surface began to frost over. Thick white crystals spread from his touch, racing outward in spirals and curves, building walls of opaque ice between him and them. You think I don't know what I'm doing? I was a keeper of light. I know what happens when the lamp goes out. Everything founders, everything breaks, so I keep this one moment burning over and over, and at least something stays whole. The walls rose higher, cutting off their view. Jonah grabbed Mira's arm and pulled her back toward the place where they'd entered. We need to jump before he seals us in, he said. But Mira was staring at the bottles, at the hundreds of glowing grains trapped inside glass. So much stolen time, so much warmth pulled from the world, and beneath it all, one man's grief so deep it had learned to freeze everything it touched. She thought of her grandmother, 2 winters gone, and the missing still felt raw some days. But she'd never tried to go back, never tried to hold on to a moment so tightly it stopped moving. Because Grandma's voice still surfaced in her memory, not trapped in amber, but alive in the way it changed and shifted with each remembering. When the ice speaks, you listen. It knows what the wind forgets. The ice was speaking now. She could feel it through her skates, a low vibration that made the lantern's flame dance. The hourglass was running low, not empty yet, but close. The sand in the lower chamber must be piled high, ready for the flip that would reset everything. If they could reach midnight stillness, if they could skate the figure 8, if they could return enough sand to make the reset. Possible. Mira, Jonah said urgently. The walls. She raised the lantern high, holding it so the light spilled over the ice walls the warden had built. The flame blazed green, fed by stolen time, and for an instant she saw through the frost, saw the bottles, saw their reflections in the clear ice beneath the white. Now, she said, and thrust the lantern toward the nearest reflection. Light bridged the gap between eras. The bottle in 1987 appeared in their hands, solid and cold and clinking with captured sand. Mira grabbed it, shoved it at Jonah, reached for another reflection. Again. Again. Pulling bottles through time like fish from deep water, dragging them into the present where they could be opened and their contents returned. The warden's cry echoed across winters. No, those are mine. You have no right. We have every right, Mira shouted back. This sand belongs to everyone, to every moment that comes after. You don't get to hoard it just because you're afraid of what comes next. The ice walls shattered, not from force, but from the sudden absence of the coal that held them. The warden had let go. Just for an instant his grip on the stolen moments had loosened, and the warmth of moving time had rushed back in. Mira and Jonah tumbled through the lens with their arms full of bottles, falling up into their own winter. They landed hard, glass clinking dangerously, sand glowing through the bottles like captured stars. Around them Milford was dying, not quickly, not dramatically, just fading, bit by bit as winter learned to steal what summer had left behind. The streetlights had gone dark. Windows showed no glow. Even the moon looked dimmer, as if the sky itself was running out of light. And it was quiet. Too quiet. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity or rattle of heat through radiator pipes. The town had gone still, frozen in a moment that refused to pass. Mira checked her phone. The screen was dark, battery drained by cold. But Jonah pulled out his pocket watch, the old mechanical kind that didn't need batteries, and held it up to the lantern light. 11:53, he said. We have 7 minutes until midnight. Maybe less if the clocks are still slipping. They ran for the lake's edge, bottles clinking with each step, the lantern swinging wild arcs of light through the darkness. Behind them, Mira thought she heard footsteps, the warden following them back, coming to reclaim what they'd stolen from his stolen hoard. At the shore, they dumped the bottles onto the ice, 27 in all, each filled with glowing sand. Jonah started opening them, pouring their contents in a careful line across the frozen surface. The grains scattered and rolled, finding their own paths, drawn toward the buried hourglass by whatever force governed their fall. Mira unscrewed the lantern's reservoir and tipped it, letting the single grain she'd taken that first night fall free. It tumbled down to join the others, and the instant it touched the ice, warmth flooded back into her chest. Not much, not enough to undo the damage of multiple jumps, but enough to remind her what it felt like to be whole, to exist in one time, one moment, with no paradox splitting her between past and present. The sand formed a glowing arc across the ice. Not complete. They hadn't found all the warden's bottles, but perhaps enough. Perhaps just enough to restore the missing star and give the hourglass permission to flip. Mira skated to the neck, to the narrow throat between the two basins where the figure 8 was carved deepest. She could see it now even without the lantern. Old marks worn by time, overlaid by fresher cuts. The warden had skated this pattern again and again, trying to find the moment that would let him stay forever. But he'd never completed it, never finished the loop at the precise instant of midnight stillness. He'd been too afraid of what would happen if time started moving again. Jonah joined her, breathing hard. "I'll hold the lantern over the missing star," he said. "You skate the 8. But Mira, we only get one chance. If the stillness comes and you're not in position, if the pattern isn't perfect, then the hourglass doesn't flip, and winter locks." She took his hand briefly, squeezed it. I know. I've been skating this lake my whole life. Trust me." She pushed off, building speed, feeling the ice beneath her blades. The lake's surface was glass smooth here, perfect for the intricate turns required. She'd skated figure eights 1,000 times, learned them from Grandma on winter afternoons when the world was bright and safe. But never like this. Never with so much weight balanced on each curve and crossing. The wind rose, then fell, rose again, gusting and dying, gusting and dying. Not stillness yet, just winter breathing, waiting for the moment between one exhale and the next. Mira carved the first loop, her left blade digging deep, her body leaning into the curve. The ice sang beneath her, a high, clear note that echoed down to the buried hourglass. She could feel the sand responding, the grains they'd scattered beginning to glow brighter. Across the lake, the warden emerged from darkness. He walked slowly now, bottles gone, hands empty. Just a man shaped by grief and cold, watching someone else try to do what he'd never dared. The wind died, not gradually, completely, as if the world had drawn a breath and forgotten to release it. Snow hung suspended in the air. Clouds stopped moving. Even Mira's breath froze in front of her face, mist hanging like a veil. Midnight stillness. Jonah raised the lantern high, holding it directly over the missing star's reflection. The flame burned bright and pure, no longer green but golden, fed by returned time and the promise of motion restored. Light spilled down through the ice, threading toward the hourglass, bridging the gap between heaven and the buried clock. Mira skated. The second loop was harder. The stillness pulled at her, tried to stop her motion, to freeze her in place like everything else. But she pushed through, her grandmother's training holding her true. Lean into the turn, feel the ice. Let your body remember what your mind forgets. The two loops joined at the neck. She crossed the intersection once, twice, weaving the pattern together. The figure eight blazed beneath her, carved lines filling with light that spread like veins through frozen stone. And deep below, the hourglass shuddered, not breaking, responding. The last grains of sand were falling through the neck, gathering in the lower chamber, completing the count. One cycle finished, ready to flip, ready to begin again. But something was wrong. Mira felt it in the ice beneath her blades, a resistance, a refusal. The hourglass wanted to turn, but something held it in place, as if an invisible hand pressed down on the upper chamber, preventing the flip. She looked toward the warden. He stood at the lake's edge, one hand extended toward the ice. His face showed no triumph, no satisfaction, just exhaustion, and a sorrow so deep it had carved channels in his features. "I can't let go," he said. His voice carried across the stillness, clear and broken. "If I let go, she's truly gone. This is all I have left, these frozen moments, this stopped time. If the hourglass flips, I have to move forward. I have to admit that the fire happened, that she died, that I failed." Mira finished the pattern and skated toward him, stopped at the boundary between ice and shore. The lantern's light still blazed above the missing star, Jonah holding it steady, maintaining the bridge, but without the warden's release the hourglass would never turn. "I know," Mira said. "I know what it's like to lose someone. My grandmother died 2 winters ago, and some days it still feels like yesterday. Like if I just skate to the right spot on this lake, I'll find her there, holding a lantern, waiting to teach me something new." "That's not the same," the warden said. "You were ready. You got to say goodbye. No one's ever ready." And I didn't get to say goodbye. She went in her sleep. One night she was there, telling me about the ice, about the stars, about time and patience. The next morning she was gone. Mira felt tears freezing on her cheeks. I kept her lantern because I wasn't ready to let go either. I thought if I held on to it, if I carried it everywhere, I could keep her with me. And did it work for a while. But you know what I realised? The lantern doesn't hold her. It holds light. It's what I do with that light that matters. She gestured at the missing star, at the way Jonah stood patient and true, holding the flame steady. I can use it to go backward, to jump into old winters and try to find her in the past, or I can use it to light the way forward, to help someone else learn to skate, to warm someone else's frozen hands, to show them that winter ends. The warden's hand wavered. But if I let go, if I let time move, then the moment passes. The perfect moment. The last time I saw her smile, the last time she called me her warden, it all vanishes. No, Mira said gently. It changes. It becomes memory instead of a moment. And memory is different. It's softer, warmer. It doesn't stay fixed like a photograph. It grows and shifts, and sometimes you forget parts, and sometimes you remember new details. But it's yours. Really yours. Not stolen, not hoarded. Just held in your heart where it can keep you warm. The warden looked at his hand, at the way frost coated his fingers. I've been cold so long, he whispered. I don't know if I remember what warmth feels like. Then let me show you. Mira took off her glove and held out her hand. The one that was still warm, still real, still part of moving time. Come back with us. Let the hourglass flip, let winter end and spring begin. You don't have to forget her. You just have to let the moment go. For a long time, the warden didn't move. Stillness held, snow suspended, breath frozen. Somewhere beyond the lake, beyond the stopped town, beyond the weight of grief that had learned to freeze the world, time waited patiently for permission to move. Then the warden reached out and took her hand. His fingers were ice, colder than any winter, colder than loss itself. But where their skin touched, warmth began to flow, not from her to him, from somewhere deeper, from the place where memory lived and changed and grew into something that could sustain instead of trap. He lowered his arm. The invisible pressure on the hourglass released. Deep beneath the ice, with a groan like continents shifting, the great timepiece began to turn. Slow at first. The upper chamber tilting toward horizontal, sand beginning to slide, then faster, the whole massive structure rotating in its bed of silt and stone, flipping end for end, resetting itself for another cycle. The thread of light Jonah held over the missing star pulsed brilliant and bright. The constellation completed, the gap filled, and suddenly Mira could see other threads, dozens of them, connecting every star in the winter sky to the hourglass below. A web of light and time, all of it flowing through the neck, all of it part of the same great cycle. The hourglass settled into its new position with a sound like a bell struck underwater. Sand began to fall again, mint-green grains drifting from the now upper chamber toward the now lower. Each grain a moment restored. Each moment a piece of warmth returned to the world. The stillness broke. Wind rushed across the lake, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine and possibility. Clouds moved. Mira's frozen breath dissipated, and from the town behind them came sound. Radiators clanking to life, electricity humming through wires, voices calling out in confusion and relief. The warden gasped. His hand in Mira's grew warmer, more solid. Colour returned to his face. Not much, but enough to show he was becoming real again. Part of moving time instead of trapped outside it. I can feel it, he said wonderingly. The warmth. It's coming back. Jonah lowered the lantern, and the light above the missing star dimmed to a normal flame. He skated toward them, grinning. The clock tower just chimed midnight, he said. Right on time, and look. He pointed at the ice beneath their feet. The figure-8 Mira had carved glowed faintly, already beginning to fade. But before it vanished completely, she saw something new. More marks, older ones, appearing beneath the fresh cuts. Hundreds of figure-8s carved by hundreds of skaters across hundreds of winters. All of them trying to keep time moving. All of them part of the same ancient ritual. Your wife, Mira said to the warden. She knew about this, didn't she? The hourglass, the missing star, the midnight stillness. He nodded slowly. Elizabeth's family had lived by this lake for generations. They were the keepers before the lighthouse came. She told me stories, but I thought they were just tales. Myths to pass the time. He looked down at the buried hourglass. After she died, I found her journal. Instructions for resetting the clock if it ever ran low. I tried to follow them, but I couldn't. I couldn't let the moment pass. So you started collecting sand instead, Jonah said, trying to hoard enough time to stay in one perfect moment forever. The warden's shoulders sagged. I thought if I could just keep that one night, the last good night before everything went wrong, I could live in it forever, be happy forever. He looked at Mira. I didn't realise I'd be freezing alone forever, that there's no warmth in a moment that doesn't move. There is now, Mira said. Look. The town lights were blazing again, bright and steady. Smoke rose from chimneys. Car engines turned over in the cold, and everywhere people were stepping outside, breathing deep, marvelling at how much warmer the air felt, as if summer had reached forward through spring to remind winter it wouldn't last forever. The warden watched it all with something like wonder on his face. Then he turned to Mira. "The lantern," he said. "Your grandmother's lantern. It still has power. I can feel it. But the sand you took, it's gone now. Returned to the hourglass. What will fuel it?" Mira looked down at the brass storm lantern in her hands. The flame burned steady and golden, fed by that mysterious oil that never ran dry. But when she peered into the reservoir, she saw something new. Not time sand. Something else. Something that glowed warm instead of cold, red gold instead of mint green. Memory light, the warden said softly. That's what Elizabeth called it. The warmth of moments willingly shared instead of hoarded. It burns brighter than stolen time, and it never runs out as long as you keep creating new memories. A gift, Mira realised. From Grandma. Not the lantern itself, but what she taught Mira to do with it. Not to trap light, but to share it. To use it to warm others instead of just herself. The warden took a step back from the shore, onto the ice. For a moment Mira thought he might try to jump again, to flee back into the stolen winters. But he just stood there, looking at his reflection in the glass-clear surface. "I should go," he said. "Find wherever people like me go when they finally let go. But before I do, thank you for showing me that warmth isn't something you hold, it's something you give." He raised one hand in farewell. Then he turned and walked toward the centre of the lake, toward the place where the hourglass lay buried. With each step he grew more transparent, more ghost-like, not dying but releasing, letting go, moving on. At the hourglass's neck he stopped and looked back. "One last thing," he called. "The missing star. It's not really missing. It's just waiting for someone brave enough to complete the constellation." He smiled, and for the first time Mira saw past the grief to the man he'd been before loss carved him hollow. "Your grandmother knew. That's why she gave you the lantern. So when the time came, you'd have light enough to bridge the gap." Then he sank through the ice like a stone through water, vanishing into the depths. For an instant Mira saw him standing beside the hourglass below, his hand pressed against the ancient glass. Then he faded, becoming part of the lake's deep magic, joining Elizabeth and all the other keepers who'd watched over time's passage. The ice rippled once, like water disturbed by a thrown stone, then stilled. Mira and Jonah stood together at the lake's edge, breathing hard, watching the lights of Milford burn bright and warm. The lantern hung heavy in Mira's hands, but it was a good weight now, not burden, but purpose. "You okay?" Jonah asked. Mira considered the question. The cold inside her was fading, slowly, melting like spring snow. Her memories were still hazy at the edges, and the taste of cocoa would probably stay flat for weeks. But something else had taken root where the cold had been. Not warmth exactly, more like the promise of warmth. The knowledge that it would return, given time and patience and the willingness to share light instead of hoarding it. "I will be," she said, "eventually." They walked back toward town together, leaving the lake to its ancient rhythms. Behind them, beneath glass-clear ice, the hourglass turned and turned, sand falling through its neck. Each grain a moment, each moment a gift, all of it flowing forward into whatever came next. At the shore, Mira stopped and looked back. The missing star's reflection shone in the ice now, complete and whole. No gap, no absence, just light where light should be, part of the constellation's ancient pattern. But when she looked up at the actual sky, the star still looked a little brighter than the others, as if it were proud of the role it played, as if it knew that some lights are worth reaching for even when they seem impossibly far away. Jonah nudged her shoulder. "Come on, I want to check my calculations, figure out exactly how far back we went, how many winters the warden stole. Maybe I can map the whole temporal structure of the lake." He paused. "Also, my mum's probably wondering where I am, and I could really use some hot chocolate that actually tastes like hot chocolate." Mira laughed, and the sound felt good. Normal, like something that belonged to moving time instead of frozen moments. She raised the lantern so its light spilled across the path ahead, golden and warm. In her pocket, something rolled and clicked. She reached in and pulled out a single grain of time sand. Not stolen. This one glowed warm instead of cold, red gold instead of mint green. A gift from the hourglass, or maybe from the warden, or maybe from Grandma, who'd always known that Mira would need light for the path ahead. Memory light, she whispered, and dropped it into the lantern's reservoir. The flame blazed brighter, not cold, not hungry, just alive, burning with the warmth of shared moments and released grief and the knowledge that winter always ended. They walked home through streets that smelled of smoke and cocoa, past houses where lights burned in every window, under stars that held their positions in the sky. Behind them the lake settled into silence. The hourglass turned. Time moved forward. And somewhere beneath the ice, in the space between one grain's fall and the next, the last keeper of the light finally rested. His vigil ended. His burden lifted. His love transformed from something that froze the world into something that warmed it. When spring came, and it would come, the hourglass had promised. The ice would melt. The lake would remember, and children would skate there again, carving figure eights in the surface, keeping time moving, never quite understanding why the pattern felt so important. But some would know. Some would carry lanterns and watch for missing stars and understand that warmth isn't something you hoard. It's something you create moment by moment, memory by memory, one shared light at a time. And that, perhaps, was enough. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The basin had no name on any map, only a warning in red ink that read unstable ground, thermal activity. Ash found it on a morning when the bathhouse thermometers had dropped 3 degrees for the 5th day running, and his father's jaw had gone tight in that particular way that meant money trouble and something worse beneath it. The trail up was one he'd run 100 times, switchbacks carved into pumice and ash, but he'd never pushed past the closed barrier before. The wood was old, half-rotted, easy to duck under. Beyond it the path narrowed to nothing, and the trees gave way to stone. Basalt columns rose from the valley floor like a forest petrified mid-reach. They weren't scattered or tumbled, but arranged, perfectly hexagonal, locked together in a lattice so precise it looked engineered. Ash stopped at the rim and counted. 6 rings of columns spreading outward from a central grate, each ring made of hundreds of black pillars fitted so close you could barely slide a knife between them. The cracks glowed. Not bright. Not yet. But a faint orange thread ran through every seam, a hairline of heat connecting one column to the next in a pattern that made his eyes water when he tried to follow it all at once. The light pulsed, slow, rhythmic, like a heartbeat made of stone. He descended without thinking, feet finding the natural steps where columns had cracked and settled. The air grew warmer with each level, dry heat that tasted of sulphur and old smoke. By the time he reached the basin floor, sweat pooled at the small of his back. The glow cracks formed paths. He could see it now, standing at the centre. The orange threads didn't just connect randomly, they swept. A molten filament as thick as his wrist traced a route from one side of the hex lattice to the other, moving with the slow inevitability of a sundial's shadow. It slid through the cracks between columns, and where it passed, the stone ticked. Not loudly, just a faint crystalline ping, like glass striking glass. Ash watched the filament complete its arc and begin another. The pattern repeated. A colossal clock face, rings for hours, filaments for hands, and time measured not in seconds but in the mountain's own slow burning. He might have stood there until sunset, hypnotized by the rhythm, but something glinted in a fumarole niche carved into the central grate. He knelt, reached past the heat shimmer, and his fingers closed around something smooth and cold. The orb fit perfectly in his palm. Mint blue glass or crystal, cool enough to frost his skin where he held it. Light moved inside it, not reflected but refracted, splitting into lines that matched the glow cracks around him. He tilted it, and the lines shifted, reorganizing themselves into new geometries. A filament swept close. He stood without meaning to, the orb raised like an offering, and the molten thread passed under his feet exactly as the seam beneath him lit bright orange. The world lurched, not spinning, not falling, just a sense of displacement so profound his stomach dropped and his vision doubled. When it cleared, he was standing in the same spot, same ring, same basin, but everything had changed. The columns steamed. Rivers of incandescent magma poured between them, filling the seams with light so fierce he had to squint. The air roared with heat, and the sky above churned black with ash. No trees on the rim, no trail, just raw volcanic throat belching fire into a world that hadn't yet learned to cool. He stumbled backward, breath coming fast, and spun the orb without thinking. Counterclockwise. The filament swept again and the lurch reversed, gentler this time, and he was back in his own present with the evening light going soft and golden over the basin. His hands shook. The orb had gone from cool to cold, frost creeping across its surface in delicate fern patterns. He shoved it in his pack and climbed out fast, not stopping until he hit the closed barrier and the forest swallowed the view behind him. That night the bathhouse thermometers read another degree lower. His father adjusted the flow valves twice, and still the steam wouldn't rise properly in the main pool. Guests complained. His mother smiled and offered discounts and watched the pressure gauges like they might tell fortunes. Ash lay in bed and realised he couldn't remember the last sunburn. Not the fact of it. He knew he'd burned badly at the lake last July, peeled for a week. Kiahi had laughed at him. But the sensation, the heat on his skin, the tight ache, the way cool water had felt like mercy. The memory was there in his head, intact and detailed, but all the warmth had been wrung out of it. It felt like a photograph, flat and distant. He pulled the orb from under his pillow and watched frost bloom across its surface. Kiahi caught him 2 days later, pack-loaded, heading up the trail before dawn. She dropped from a boulder where she'd been waiting and blocked his path with crossed arms and an expression that said she'd practiced this confrontation in the mirror. "You jumped," she said, not a question. Ash tried lying. "I don't know what—" "You came back from somewhere yesterday with no colour in your face and eyes like you'd seen a ghost, and you didn't text me for 16 hours, which means either you died or you found something you think is too dangerous to share, and I know you didn't die because you're terrible at haunting." She held out her hand. "Show me." He showed her. They stood on the second ring, Ash holding the orb, Kiahi with her climbing rope coiled over one shoulder, and her usual expression of fearless curiosity lighting her face. The filament approached, slow and steady, its glow reflecting in Kiahi's dark eyes. "So you just—" she started. "Stand on a seam and raise it when the filament passes," Ash said. "Clockwise for forward, counter for back. Distance depends on which ring you're standing on." "Have you tested all of them?" 3. This one goes back about 30s. Years. The outer ring is maybe a century. Inner rings are less. And the cost. He told her about the sunburn, about checking his other memories that morning and finding more holes, the warmth of his mother's bread, the heat of embarrassment when he'd tripped during a race, the flush of pride after summiting his first real peak. All the sensations leached away, leaving only the facts. Kiahi listened without interrupting, then walked a slow circle around the centre grate, studying the pattern of filaments, 6 of them now, overlapping in complex curves, each tracing its own ring at its own pace. "It's cooling the mountain too," she said finally. "Your house runs on these springs. If you keep jumping—" "I know." "So we figure out the rules and we stop." She pulled chalk from her belt pouch and marked the seam where they stood with a bright yellow X. "Training run, 1 jump, observe, come right back, document everything." They spent 3 days mapping the basin. Ash jumped to a time before the last eruption and found the valley lush with forest, birds wheeling overhead in species he didn't recognise. He jumped forward to a future where the bathhouse was a dry husk and tour groups wandered the hex clock with audio guides. The springs long dead. Each return stripped another memory of its warmth, his father's hand on his shoulder, the fever heat of his worst flu, even the sharp burn of touching a hot stove as a child. Kiahi didn't jump. She climbed instead, free soloing the columns to mark safe paths and timing the filaments with a runner's watch. She discovered the ash fireflies, tiny sparks of cinder that rode the updrafts and drifted, always drifted toward the next place a filament would sweep. A living metronome. "They know something we don't," she said, sketching their paths in her notebook. "They're following a pattern." On the 4th day they found Dr. Sorrell. She was kneeling at a crossing point where 2 filaments intersected, a bulky piece of equipment set up on a tripod beside her. The device looked like a surveying tool crossed with something medical, all lenses and calibrated dials, and where its beam touched the glowing cracks, the light changed, shifted from orange to a frozen blue-white that didn't pulse, didn't move, just held steady like a paused video. Ash and Kiahi watched from behind a column as Sorel extracted something from the locked filament. A crystal the size of a thumb, glowing with captured heat. She dropped it in a padded case with a dozen others and adjusted the device, pinning the filament more securely. Time ore, she said, without turning around. That's what I call it. Temporal energy crystallized by volcanic pressure. I've been tracking this site for 6 years. Kiahi's hand found Ash's wrist squeezed once, a warning. Sorel stood and faced them. She was younger than Ash expected, maybe 40, with silver threading her black hair and eyes that looked like they'd memorized geological charts. A.E., chronogeologist, she'd called herself in the grant proposal he later found online, specialist in thermal temporal phenomena, which apparently meant she devoted her career to finding places where time and heat intersected, and she'd just found the richest vein in the world. "You're the bathhouse kid," she said to Ash. "Your springs are dying because this clock is winding down. The mountain's burning out." She gestured at the basin. "But I can fix it. Lock all 6 filaments at their peak output, harvest the time ore, and generate enough energy to power the entire region indefinitely. Your town stays warm. I get my research funded. Everyone wins." "Except the mountain," Kiahi said. Sorel's smile went thin. "The mountain doesn't care. It's a geological process, not a living thing. This," she tapped the frozen filament, "is preservation, sustainability. The alternative is watching everything go cold." Ash felt the orb in his pocket, frost seeping through the fabric. What happens when you lock all 6? The cycle stabilizes. No more eruptions, no more decline. A perfect minute, frozen in amber. She packed her equipment with practiced efficiency. "I'm pinning the 4th hand tomorrow. You should be at home when I finish the 6th. The transitional pulse can be disorienting for organic matter." She left them there with the locked filament humming its frozen note, and ash fireflies circling, confused, unable to find the rhythm they'd always known. That night the bathhouse pressure dropped to half. The main pool sat tepid and still, and guests checked out early. Ash's father didn't adjust the valves, just stood looking at the gauges with his hands in his pockets, and his mother touched his back in a way that meant they'd had this conversation before, in private, where their son wouldn't hear the words bankruptcy or foreclosure, or the name of the city they'd have to move to. Ash tried to remember the warmth of his father's rare hugs, found only the fact that they'd happened, and the shape they'd taken, but no heat in the memory at all. He went back to the basin before dawn. Kiahi was already there. Of course she was. She'd roped off 3 of the frozen filaments and marked Sorel's equipment caches with orange flags. "She's got the 4th ready to pin at the 10-minute crossing," Kiahi said. "We have maybe an hour before she starts." "We can't let her freeze it." "I know, but if we don't, the springs fail anyway. The mountain's cooling on its own." "I know that too." Kiahi pulled her notebook out, pages covered in sketches and calculations. "So we don't stop her and we don't let it cool. We do the thing that scares us most." She showed him the pattern. 6 filaments, 6 rings, and a moment. Just one, maybe 30 seconds long, when the mountain took its breath before erupting. A pressure lull between inhale and blast, when all 6 hands aligned into a perfect hexagonal star, and the system reset itself. If Ash stood at the centre with the orb, raised, if he could time it exactly right, the heat would surge back through every memory he'd stolen from, through every spring the mountain fed, through the whole cycle that Sorel wanted to murder with her pins. "You'd have to be standing there during an eruption," Ash said. "During the lull before it, not the eruption itself." "And if I'm off by 5 seconds?" Kiahi's smile held no comfort. "Then you're standing at the centre of a volcanic vent when it goes active." They had no better plan. Ash had exhausted his supply of clever fixes, and the bathhouse thermometers were still dropping, and his mother had started packing boxes in the storage room when she thought no one was looking. The plan was simple in the way that made Ash's pulse hammer in his throat. Kiahi would free climb to the pinned filaments and physically destroy Sorel's devices, while Ash timed the remaining hands using the ash fireflies as guides. When all 6 filaments moved free and the star alignment approached, he'd raise the orb at the centre grate and hold position through the lull. They started at dusk when the light went copper, and the ash fireflies rose in clouds, sparking against the darkening sky. Sorel was faster than they'd anticipated. By the time they reached the 4th ring, she'd pinned the 5th filament and was setting up on the 6th. Her drones buzzed overhead, surveying and recording, and Ash could see the Timor crystals in her pack. Dozens of them, glowing cold and stolen. Kiahi went first, climbing bare-handed, finding holds in the column faces that shouldn't have existed. She reached the first pin and smashed it with a climbing hammer, and the filament sprang free with a sound like a wire snapping. The mountain shuddered. Sorrel shouted something, but her voice was lost in the sudden roar of released pressure. Ash ran for the centre, counting beats, watching the fireflies. They swirled in confused patterns as filaments accelerated, no longer held by artificial constraint, speeding toward their natural rhythm. He could feel the heat rising through the soles of his shoes, the basin waking from Sorrel's forced sleep. Kiahi hit the second pin, the third. Filaments whipped through the cracks faster now, light strobing across the columns, and the drones wheeled and dove but couldn't find their target in the smoke and steam that was beginning to pour from every vent. The fourth pin went and Sorrel lunged for Ash, but Kiahi dropped from a column between them, rope in hand, and Ash didn't see how it ended because the fireflies had started to spiral, all of them at once, rising in a column that pointed to the centre grate, and he knew, felt it in his bones like a runner feels the last 100 metres, that the lull was coming. He reached the centre as the sixth filament broke free. All 6 hands swept the basin in accelerating curves, and Ash stood with the orb raised and his breath coming fast. The mountain inhaled. He felt it in the sudden vacuum, the way all. The steam and smoke reversed direction and poured downward into the throat of the volcano, gathering itself for the coming blast. The filaments aligned. Not perfectly, not yet, but close. He rotated the orb, tiny adjustments, guiding them with pressure and intention. He didn't fully understand, but trusted anyway. The way he trusted his feet on a trail, the way he knew when to sprint and when to hold pace. The first filament locked into position on a hex star point. The second, third. The mountain's inhale deepened, pressure building behind the temporary seal. Fourth filament, fifth. Ash's hands shook, but he held steady, feeling the weight of every memory he'd stolen from, every degree of warmth he'd pulled out of his own life and the springs that fed his home. The sixth filament slid into place and the star locked true. The lull hit like silence after thunder. Everything stopped. Wind, smoke, sound, and for one perfect breath the basin held absolutely still. Ash set the orb in the centre grate, feeling it click into a socket he hadn't known was there, and heat surged back through every channel at once. The hex star detonated. Not with fire, but with light. Harmless and brilliant, mint blue mixed with orange gold, and the wave of it blasted outward through every seam and crack. Sorrel's remaining pins scattered, sent tumbling into older years where they'd never be found, and her drones dropped from the sky like birds struck by lightning. The columns sang, each one a different note, a different pitch, and together they made a sound like a massive organ pipe filling with breath. The mountain vented clean, not erupting, just releasing, letting pressure equalise through 1,000 small fumaroles instead of one catastrophic blast. Ash fell backward, away from the grate, and lay on stone that had gone from cold to pleasantly warm. Above him the sky cleared, and ash fireflies danced in lazy spirals, following filaments that moved again with their ancient, reliable rhythm. Kiahi pulled him upright. Her face was streaked with ash, and her hands were bleeding from the climb, but she was grinning the wild grin of someone who'd just free-soloed a face that shouldn't have been possible. "The gauges," Ash said. "Did it work?" "Won't know until we're down, but feel your hands." He did. They were warm, not burning, just alive with ordinary heat, the kind that came from exertion and adrenaline and standing too close to an active thermal vent. He checked his memories carefully, rifling through them like flashcards. The sunburn was still flat, still distant, but there was a flicker of something in it now, a promise of heat waiting to return. They found Sorrel at the rim, sitting with her empty pack and her useless drones and one Timor crystal she'd palmed before everything broke. She didn't try to stop them leaving, just studied the crystal in the fading light and said, "You didn't fix anything, you only let it keep dying slowly." "No," Kiahi said. "We let it keep living." The walk down took an hour in the dark, following the trail by memory and the glow of Kiahi's headlamp. They reached town as the bathhouse lights were coming on, and Ash saw his father standing outside, hand on one of the external pipes, and even from a distance he could see the steam beginning to curl from the vents again. The thermometers climbed through the night. 3 degrees by midnight, another 2 by dawn. Not to where they'd been before. The mountain had cooled, would always cool. That was the nature of volcanic cycles. But enough. Enough for the springs to run warm, for guests to book rooms, for the gauges to show numbers in the safe green range. Ash's memories didn't return all at once. They heated slowly, like stones left in sun, regaining their warmth in pulses that came when he wasn't paying attention. He'd be running a trail and suddenly remember what heat shimmer on pavement felt like. Eating breakfast and the memory of warm bread would bloom with butter smell and steam. His father's hug before bed came with actual warmth one night a week later, and Ash held on longer than usual, feeling the heat transfer between them like they were stones in the same spring. Keahi kept one of the scattered Timor crystals, the smallest size of a pebble. She put it in the bathhouse window where it caught afternoon light and glowed faint mint at closing time, a reminder of the clock that still ticked beneath them, the hands that still swept their ancient patterns, the heat that still cycled through the mountain's bones as it had for millennia. Sorel left town, but not the region. Ash spotted her once at a coffee shop, laptop open to seismic data, a single pin on the table beside her mug. She caught his eye and lifted the pin in something between salute and warning. Her work wasn't finished. It would never be finished. Not while mountains breathed and time flowed, and people like her saw cycles as problems to solve instead of rhythms to join. The bathhouse stayed open. The springs flowed warm, not hot, sustainable, fed by a volcano that had remembered how to breathe. And sometimes, on mornings when mist hung low in the valley, Ash would run up to where the closed barrier marked the trail's end, and he'd listen for the distant sound of basalt columns singing their slow measure, counting time in the language of stone and fire, a colossal clock that would tick long after human concerns had cooled to nothing. He never took the orb back. It sat on his desk, frost creeping across its surface, lines refracting into patterns he was learning to read. Not to use, just to watch. To remember that some things were meant to move in cycles, that warmth was precious because it faded, and that the truest way to save something wasn't to freeze it perfect, but to let it burn and cool and burn again, following its own deep rhythm until the mountain itself decided the time had come to sleep. Winter came early that year. The first snow fell in October, unusual for the region, and it dusted the rim of the basin in white that looked almost ceremonial against the black basalt. Ash made the climb on a Saturday when the bathhouse was full, and his parents were arguing again, though this time about whether to expand the soaking rooms or invest in better filtration. Good arguments, the kind that meant survival instead of surrender. Keahi met him at the closed barrier with thermoses of coffee, and that particular expression she wore when she'd been thinking dangerous thoughts in private and was ready to share them. "I've been timing the filaments," she said as they walked, "tracking them against lunar cycles, tidal patterns, seismic activity in the region. There's a correspondence. To what? Everything. The mountain isn't isolated. It's responding to pressure changes across the entire tectonic plate. When the filaments slow, it's because the whole system is redistributing energy. When they speed up, something's building somewhere else." Exactly. She pulled out her notebook, now full of graphs and calculations that looked more like art than science. Sorel was wrong about sustainability. You can't harvest from one node without affecting the whole network. But she was right that the mountain is cooling, just not dying, maturing. They reached the rim and looked down into the basin. The columns stood quiet in the weak winter light, their glow cracks barely visible, just the faintest pulse of orange threading through black stone. The ash fireflies were gone, dormant or migrated, leaving the air still and cold. Ash could feel the absence where the orb had been. He'd left it at home deliberately, afraid of the temptation to jump to see if the mountain's past held answers to its future. But standing here without it, he felt something else. A different kind of knowing, slower and deeper, the kind that came from watching instead of interfering. "It's teaching us its rhythm," Keahi said, "if we're patient enough to learn." They spent the afternoon documenting the basin's winter state. Keahi photographed the column formations from different angles, measuring shadows and estimating how the low sun would track across the lattice in different months. Ash walked the rings again, this time feeling for temperature gradients with his bare hands, mapping which seams held residual heat and which had gone cold. On the third ring he found something new, a column that had cracked vertically, the split no wider than his finger, and in that crack something grew. A plant he didn't recognise, something primitive and ancient, with fleshy leaves that felt warm to the touch, even in the freezing air. It grew nowhere else in the basin, just this one crack in this one column, sustained by whatever heat still rose from below. Thermophile, Kiahi said, kneeling beside it. Probably been here for centuries, dormant when the mountain cools, active when it warms. It's old ash, older than the last eruption, maybe older than 10 eruptions. She didn't touch it, neither did he. They just looked at it, this tiny ambassador from the mountain's deep time, proof that the cycles they'd glimpsed were longer and stranger than they'd imagined. The winter deepened, and the bathhouse thrived in the way old businesses do when they've survived one more brush with extinction. Ash's father hired 2 new attendants, and his mother started teaching yoga classes in the meditation room they'd built, where the storage closet used to be. The gauges held steady, not optimal, but reliable, and reliability was its own kind of wealth. Ash returned to the basin every few weeks, sometimes with Kiahi, more often alone. He never brought the orb. Instead, he brought his notebook and his runner's watch, and the patience Kiahi had talked about, timing the filaments as they moved through their long circuits, noting when they accelerated or slowed, trying to learn the language the mountain spoke in pulses of heat and light. He began to notice patterns. The filaments moved faster on new moons, slower when the snowpack was heaviest on the peaks around them. They responded to distant earthquakes, speeding up hours before the seismic waves arrived, as if the mountain could feel trouble coming through the bedrock itself. And once, during a particularly violent storm, all 6 filaments stopped completely for 17 seconds. And in that frozen moment, Ash felt the pressure change in his ears, felt something vast holding its breath before the thunder cracked and the filaments resumed their sweep. The orb on his desk grew a thin layer of ice one night in January. Not frost, actual ice. Crystalline and permanent, sealing the mint-blue glass in a shell of frozen water that hadn't been there. Ash tried to chip it away and found he couldn't. The ice was harder than it should be, cold enough to burn his fingers. He brought it to Kiahi, who studied it under her desk lamp with the focused intensity she usually reserved for climbing routes. "It's storing something," she said finally, "or releasing it. The orb was never just a key, it was a battery. Every jump you made charged it with temporal energy, and now that the cycle is stable again, it's discharging, slowly. Over years, probably. Discharging into what? Into you, into the basin, into every memory you stole heat from." She turned the orb carefully, watching how light refracted through the ice. This is how the mountain heals itself. Not all at once, in cycles so slow we're not built to perceive them. Ash took the orb back and set it in the window beside Kiahi's time ore crystal. The 2 objects sat there like mismatched bookends, one freezing itself in layers, the other holding its stolen warmth in suspension. Together they glowed faint and strange at certain hours, and guests sometimes asked what they were, and Ash's mother would say they were art, geological samples, gifts from friends, whatever story felt true enough. Spring came late, but it came. The snow, retreated from the basin rim and the thermophil in the cracked column, bloomed with tiny red flowers that lasted 3 days before withering back to dormancy. The ash fireflies returned in April, rising from vents that had been sealed all winter, and their patterns were different now, more complex, as if they'd learned something in their long sleep beneath the stone. Ash made the climb on the spring equinox, early morning, the kind of light that makes everything look new-minted and full of promise. He reached the basin as the sun cleared the eastern peaks and saw something that stopped him at the rim, a 7th filament. It was thin, barely visible, threading through cracks in the outermost ring where no filament had moved before. Its glow was different too, not orange, but gold, pure and bright, tracing a path that spiraled inward toward the centre instead of sweeping around the rings. He watched it for an hour, timing its progress, and realised it was moving backward, counter to the other 6, unwinding instead of winding, following a route that the other filaments never touched. Kiahi arrived before noon, summoned by his text, and they sat together watching the seventh hand trace its impossible course. "It's new," she said, "or it's been dormant and now it's active. Either way, the mountain is changing. Is that bad? I don't know. Change isn't good or bad, it just is." She marked the filament's position in her notebook, sketching its spiral path. "But it means the system is still evolving, still alive in ways Sorel never accounted for." They stayed until sunset, watching all 7 filaments move through their patterns, overlapping and separating in rhythms that seemed both random and deeply ordered. And when the light failed, and the columns began to sing their evening note, Ash felt something he hadn't felt since the night of the Hex Star. Not fear, not exactly. More like awe. The sense of standing at the edge of something vast and patient, something that would outlast his understanding and his life and the lives of everyone he knew. The bathhouse prospered. The town grew, carefully, in the way communities do when they've learned the difference between expansion and excess. New families moved in, drawn by the springs and the mountain and stories of the basin that sounded like myths but weren't, quite. The thermal boreholes stayed warm, the pressure held, and every night at closing time the Timor crystal in the window glowed its faint mint farewell, and the ice-sealed orb beside it reflected the light in patterns that shifted with the seasons. Ash graduated high school that spring. Kiahai had already committed to a geology program on the mainland, her application essay about thermal temporal phenomena earning her a full scholarship and 3 interview requests from professors who thought she was kidding about the hex clock until she sent them her documentation. They'd both be leaving in the fall, moving toward futures that a year ago had seemed impossible when the gauges were dropping and bankruptcy loomed. But before they left, they made one final climb together. Late August, a week before Keahi's flight, they hiked up in the dark to reach the basin at dawn. They brought no equipment this time, no notebooks or cameras, just themselves and the question that had haunted them both all summer. The 7th filament had completed its inward spiral. It now threaded through the centre grate, moving through cracks they'd never seen before, illuminating chambers beneath the basin that the other 6 filaments never reached. Where it passed, the stone didn't tick. It hummed, a note so low they felt it more than heard it, vibrating up through their bones. "It's a reset," Kiahi said. "Not for the mountain, for the clock itself. Every 100 years, maybe every 1,000, this 7th hand winds through and realigns everything, checks the mechanism, makes sure the cycle stays true." "How long does it take?" "Years, decades, time enough for mountains." They sat at the centre, careful not to touch the grate where the 7th filament pulsed, and watched the sun rise over the basin. The ash fireflies emerged with the light, thousands of them, spiralling upward in columns that matched the pattern of the filaments below. Above them, the sky went pale blue, then gold, then the deep, brilliant azure that meant high pressure and clear weather, the kind of day that made you believe the world was stable even when you knew better. Ash's memories had warmed fully by then, all of them, heated slowly over months until even the oldest ones, childhood fevers, summer sunburn, his father's rare embrace, glowed with their original heat. But they were different now, richer, layered, as if the cooling and reheating had changed their structure, the way carbon under pressure becomes diamond. "We're not going to stop her," Ash said. "Sorrel, she's still out there, still researching. Eventually she'll find another site or she'll come back here with better equipment." "I know. And we're leaving. The mountain won't have us to watch it." "The mountain doesn't need us," Kiai said. "It never did. We just needed it to teach us what time actually means when you're not trying to stop it." They stayed until noon, until the heat grew too intense and they had to retreat to the shaded rim. From there they could see the whole basin, all 7 filaments moving through their intricate dance, and beyond it the town nestled in the valley with its rising steam and its surviving bathhouse and its people who still depended on heat they didn't fully understand. Ash thought about his parents, about the gauges they checked every morning, about the invisible thread connecting their small business to the vast slow breathing of the mountain. He thought about all the people who lived near volcanoes, near fault lines, near rivers that flooded and winds that destroyed, people who'd learned to measure their lives against forces that would outlast them by epochs. "We'll come back," Kiai said. "Holidays, summer breaks. And someone else will find the basin eventually. Someone who needs to learn what we learned." What if they don't? What if they're like Sorel? Then the mountain will teach them too. Harder maybe, but it'll teach them. They made the descent in silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that comes from having said everything that needed saying. At the closed barrier they paused, looking back up the trail one last time, and Ash thought he could hear it even from this distance, the faint crystalline tick of stone counting time in a rhythm older than memory. The bathhouse was busy when they arrived. Weekend rush, every pool full, steam rising in lazy columns through the open roof panels. Ash's father was at the front desk joking with guests, and his mother was leading a yoga class in the meditation room, her voice carrying the same steady calm she'd maintained through bankruptcy threats and miracle recoveries. The gauges on the wall showed optimal pressure, optimal temperature, optimal flow. Everything exactly as it should be, for now, in this particular moment, until the cycle turned again. Ash and Keahi went to the private pool in the back, the small one fed by the oldest spring, and sat on the edge with their feet in water that came from somewhere deep and hot and inexplicable. The Timor crystal in the window caught afternoon light and glowed. The ice-sealed orb beside it had thawed overnight, he'd checked that morning, revealing the mint-blue glass beneath, clear and empty and ready for whatever came next. "Do you think we made the right choice?" Ash asked, letting it stay wild instead of letting her lock it. Keahi was quiet for a long time, watching steam rise from the water. "I think there wasn't a choice. Not really. The mountain was always going to do what it does. We just decided whether to work with it or against it, whether to learn its rhythm or try to stop it. And now? Now we live with what we learned. We carry it with us. And when the cycle turns again, when it cools, when it heats, when it erupts or goes dormant or does something neither of us can predict, we'll remember that trying to freeze a perfect moment is just another way of killing it." The sun moved toward the peaks. Closing time approached. The last guests filtered out, satisfied and drowsy with heat, and Ash's parents began their evening routine of checking valves and balancing flows, their movements synchronized by years of practice. Ash watched them work and saw the warmth between them, not the dramatic heat of new love, but the steady, sustainable warmth of a well-tended fire. And he understood finally what the mountain had been trying to teach him all along. That warmth wasn't meant to be hoarded or frozen or extracted. It was meant to cycle, to move through systems, through seasons, through the bones of the earth and the memories of those who lived above it. Take too much and the system cooled. Try to hold it forever and it died in your hands. But let it flow, let it breathe, let it follow its own deep rhythm, and it would return. Not always when you wanted, not always as much as you needed, but enough to live by. The orb sat in his bedroom window through his last week at home. He'd wake in the night sometimes and see it glowing faint mint in the darkness, the frost patterns on his window echoing the refracted lines inside the glass. Once he dreamed he was standing in the basin, and all 7 filaments were moving in perfect synchronization, and the mountain was speaking in a language made of heat and time, and he understood every word but couldn't remember any of it when he woke. Keahi left first, early September, her truck loaded with climbing gear and geology textbooks, and 3 notebooks full of observations that would become the foundation of her doctoral thesis years later. They didn't make a ceremony of it, just hugged in the bathhouse parking lot while steam rose around them, and she said, "Check on it sometimes. Let me know if the 7th hand does anything weird." Weirder than existing at all? Yeah, weirder than that. Ash left a week later. His parents drove him to the airport through morning mist, and his father talked about expansion plans and his mother talked about the new meditation instructor they'd hired, and neither of them mentioned the boxes they'd packed months ago that were still stacked in the storage room, kept now as a reminder instead of a necessity. Insurance against forgetting how close they'd come to losing everything. At the security checkpoint, his mother hugged him, and he felt the warmth of it, really felt it. The heat transfer from her body to his, and he knew he'd remember this one. It would stay warm in his memory because he wasn't stealing from it anymore, wasn't using it as fuel for impossible jumps through time, just letting it be what it was. A moment of warmth in a life full of cooling and heating, and the endless patient cycles between. The first semester passed in a blur of classes and homesickness, and late-night phone calls with Keahi, comparing notes on thermodynamics and temporal theory. He studied environmental science with a focus on geothermal systems, and his professors were impressed by his practical knowledge, Though puzzled by some of his questions about heat as a form of memory, about whether geological formations could hold time like batteries, about the relationship between extraction and stewardship. He didn't tell them about the basin. Some things weren't meant for academic papers or peer review. Some things were meant to be experienced directly, learned slowly, earned through patience and respect and the willingness to stand in the centre of something vast without trying to control it. Winter break brought him home to find the town subtly changed. A new hotel on the edge of the valley, built to capitalise on the thermal tourism that had grown since the spring stabilised. More visitors, more cars, more people asking questions about the geology and taking photos of the steam vents and wanting guided tours to places that didn't have names on maps. His father was wary but adaptable. "Growth is like heat," he said one night, checking the gauges that still held steady, still showed optimal numbers. Too much too fast and the system can't handle it, but the right amount at the right pace, that's just part of the cycle. Ash made the climb to the basin on Christmas Eve, alone this time, through fresh snow that made the trail treacherous and beautiful. The closed barrier had been reinforced, a new sign warning of unstable ground and thermal activity, but the wood was still old and he still knew how to slip past. The basin wore winter like a crown. Snow gathered on the column tops but melted in the cracks where heat still rose, creating patterns of white and black that looked almost deliberate. The 7 filaments moved through their courses unhurried, and the 7th hand had progressed another fraction of its inward spiral, now threading through depths Ash couldn't see from the rim. He sat for an hour, watching, timing, documenting nothing, just being present with the mountain's slow breathing. The ash fireflies were dormant, but he could feel them waiting in the stone, ready to emerge when the season turned. And in the deepest crack on the 3rd ring, the ancient thermophil showed the faintest hint of green, preparing for a spring that was still months away, but that the mountain already anticipated. Movement on the opposite rim made him look up. A figure standing in the trees, watching the basin with binoculars and what looked like surveying equipment. Too distant to identify, but the posture was familiar. The stillness of someone who'd learned to observe without interfering, to measure without taking. Sorrel, or someone like her. There would always be someone like her, someone who saw the basin and thought about what could be extracted, about how to freeze a perfect minute and harvest it forever. The mountain would have to teach them what it had taught Ash, or it would have to defend itself in the only way mountains knew how, by being patient, by outlasting human ambition, by continuing its cycles until everyone who wanted to stop them had turned to dust. Ash stood and made his way down carefully, leaving tracks in the snow that would melt by afternoon. At the bottom he looked back once and saw the figure still there, still watching, and he felt neither fear nor anger, just a kind of recognition. They were all students of the same vast slow teacher. Some would learn faster than others, some would learn too late, but the mountain would keep teaching, keep breathing, keep counting time in the language of stone and fire until time itself ran out. The spring semester brought new challenges and new understanding. Ash wrote papers on sustainable geothermal harvesting, on the difference between extraction and partnership, on indigenous stewardship models that treated thermal features as living relatives rather than resources. His professors were intrigued but sceptical. The paradigm they worked in didn't leave much room for mountains as teachers, or heat as something with memory, or the idea that the best way to preserve a system might be to let it change. But he kept writing, kept researching, kept building the framework that would one day let him return to his valley, not as a fixer, but as a steward. Someone who understood that the gauges in the bathhouse weren't just measuring pressure and temperature, but the health of a relationship between his family and the mountain that fed them. Someone who knew that sustainability wasn't about locking systems in place, but about learning to dance with their rhythms, to take only what you needed when the mountain was willing to give, to step back when the cycle turned toward conservation. Keahi's research progressed faster. By summer, she'd co-authored a paper on temporal thermal phenomena that got picked up by a journal, carefully anonymised and scrubbed of any details that might identify the hex clock, but preserved the crucial insight that some geothermal features operated on timescales so vast they appeared stable to human observation, but were in fact dynamically responsive to pressures both local and tectonic, both immediate and ancient. They met at the bathhouse in July, both home for a week between summer internships. The place was thriving now, featured in a travel magazine, booked solid through September. Ash's parents had hired a full staff and his mother had stopped checking the gauges compulsively, though his father still did every morning, a ritual of reassurance more than necessity. "It's holding," Ash said, watching his father's routine from the meditation room doorway. "It's more than holding," his father replied. "It's better than it was before the drop, steadier, like whatever was wrong worked itself out." "Or was worked out," Ash's mother added, joining them with tea that steamed in the morning cool. She looked at her son with an expression that suggested she knew more than she'd said, had pieced together the absences and the strange questions, and the way he'd come back different from his explorations. Sometimes things need to break before they can heal properly. Sometimes the fix isn't stopping the break, but letting it complete, and then tending what grows after. They made the climb together, all three of them, Ash and Kiahai and one of his father's old friends who'd been a ranger before retirement, and who knew the mountain in ways that predated maps and GPS. He led them past the closed barrier without hesitation, and Ash realised the sign was as much performance as protection, keeping out the tourists who wouldn't respect what they found, while remaining permeable to those who would. The ranger stopped at the rim and gestured for silence. Below them the basin stretched in, its perfect hexagonal symmetry, and all 7 filaments were moving in a pattern Ash had never seen before. Not the usual separate paths, but woven together, intersecting and separating in a dance so complex it made his eyes water to follow. The ash fireflies had emerged in daylight, something he'd never witnessed, and they moved in formations that matched the filaments below, as above, so below, a correspondence between earth and air that suggested intelligence or purpose, or something that transcended both. "It does this sometimes," the ranger said quietly. "My grandfather brought me here when I was young, told me stories about the clock, about how it marked time not just for the mountain, but for the whole region. Said there were families who'd watched it for generations, passing down the knowledge of its rhythms, teaching their children to read what the filaments were saying." "What are they saying now?" Gyahi asked. The ranger was quiet for a long time, watching the dance of light and ash. "That something's coming, not an eruption. The mountain's not building toward that. Something else, a shift, the kind that happens every few hundred years when the tectonic plates adjust themselves, won't be catastrophic, won't even be noticeable to most people, but the mountain feels it coming, and it's preparing." "Should we warn people?" Ash asked. "Warn them of what? That the ground beneath them moves? They live on a volcano, they already know." The ranger smiled. "No, what you do is watch, document, learn. So when the shift comes and people panic because their compasses read wrong for a week, or the springs change temperature or the trees lean different, you can tell them it's natural, part of the cycle, nothing to freeze or fix or fear." They stayed until the pattern resolved, the 7 filaments separating again into their individual paths, the ash fireflies settling back into their usual drift and rise rhythm. And when they descended, Ash felt something settle in his chest, a weight he'd been carrying without naming it finally easing into acceptance. He couldn't stop Sorel or people like her, couldn't prevent extraction or exploitation, or the 1,000 ways humans would try to harvest what should be honoured, but he could be present, could document and teach and pass down the knowledge of what he'd learned, could stand between the mountain and those who'd harm it, not with force but with understanding, offering an alternative to freezing perfect minutes, the choice to live inside cycles, to accept warmth and cooling both, to measure wealth not in what you held but in what you let flow through. The orb stayed on his desk through his college years, the ice shell gradually thinning as whatever it had stored continued to discharge. By graduation it was clear again, the mint blue glass visible, the refracted lines inside dormant but not dead, just waiting. Kiai's Timor crystal sat beside it in her dorm room, then her apartment, then her first office as a junior researcher, glowing faint at closing time wherever she was, a reminder of the basin and the mountain and the lesson they'd learned together. Ash returned home after graduation to work with his parents, learning the bathhouse business from foundation to roof, understanding it now as a collaboration with the mountain rather than an extraction from it. He took over checking the gauges each morning, reading them not just for numbers but for the story they told about the mountain's mood, its generosity, its need to conserve. And on days when the temperature dropped or the pressure wavered, he didn't panic or try to fix it. Just noted it, adjusted their operations, and trusted the cycle to complete. Keahi got her doctorate and turned down positions at major universities to work with indigenous communities studying traditional thermal stewardship. She travelled to Iceland and New Zealand and Japan, everywhere volcanoes touched human lives, and everywhere she went she carried her notebooks and her understanding that some knowledge couldn't be extracted, only earned through relationship and time. They stayed in touch across years and distance, comparing notes, sharing observations, building between them a body of knowledge that existed outside academia, outside official channels, preserved instead in conversations and letters, and the occasional visit to the basin where it all began. Sorrel published her own papers, technical and brilliant, proposing methods for sustainable geothermal harvesting that sounded reasonable until you understood what she meant by sustainable. Not cyclical, but static. Not flowing, but frozen. She got funding, built prototypes, tested them in places that couldn't teach her what the basin had tried to teach. Some of her projects succeeded in the short term, others failed catastrophically. And slowly, through trial and error and equations that never quite balanced, she began to learn what Ash and Keahi had learned, that you couldn't separate time from heat, that extraction had costs beyond what thermodynamics predicted, that the mountain knew things human measurement couldn't capture. 20 years after Ash first climbed past the closed barrier, he brought his daughter to the basin. She was 7, curious and fearless like Keahi had been, and she walked the rim without fear while ash fireflies spiralled around her like she was one of the columns they used for navigation. "How many hands does it have?" she asked, pointing to the filaments that swept the cracks. 7, Ash said. 6 that count the hours and 1 that counts something longer. Years, maybe, or centuries. "Can I touch it?" "The clock?" "No. You watch it. Learn from it. Let it teach you about time and heat and how things that seem permanent are really just moving very slowly." She seemed to accept this, standing quiet beside him, as the filaments traced their paths and the mountain breathed beneath them. The springs had held steady for 2 decades now, reliable, enough that the bathhouse had expanded twice, carefully, building only what the heat supply could sustain. The town had grown around that limitation, learning to measure its ambitions against the mountain's generosity, developing a culture of stewardship that tourists found charming and old-fashioned, but that Ash knew was simply practical. "Daddy," his daughter said, "why is that column glowing different?" He looked where she pointed. The 3rd ring, the crack where the ancient thermophile grew. The plant was blooming, its red flowers vivid against black stone, but the glow beneath it had changed. Not orange, but gold, the colour of the 7th filament, and even as he watched, a thin tendril of golden light separated from the main spiral and threaded upward through the crack, feeding the plant with something that looked like light but felt like time. A branch. The 7th hand growing branches, feeding systems within the mountain that had been dormant for however long it took for the clock itself to complete its largest cycle. Ash had never seen this, had no documentation of it in his notes, or Keahi's, or any of the records the Rangers family had kept, which meant it was rare, maybe once in a millennium rare, maybe once in the mountain's entire life. He pulled out his phone to take a photo, then stopped, put it away. Some things weren't meant to be captured or documented or shared. Some things were meant to be witnessed in silence and held in memory, where they'd warm you through long winters and cold doubts, and the times when you forgot why you'd chosen stewardship over extraction, relationship over resource. "What is it?" his daughter asked. "It's the mountain growing," Ash said, "changing, becoming something new while staying exactly what it's always been." They watched until the golden tendril faded, reabsorbing into the 7th hand spiral, and the thermophile's flowers began to close, their brief moment of glory passing back into dormancy. And when they descended, his daughter asked questions the whole way down, about heat and time and whether mountains dreamed and whether the clock ever stopped. And Ash answered what he could and said, "I don't know," to the rest, teaching her the same lesson the mountain had taught him, that not knowing was okay, that mystery was as important as knowledge, that some questions were meant to be lived with rather than solved. The bathhouse glowed in the valley below, steam rising from its pools to meet evening mist, and somewhere in one of those pools his wife was soaking after her shift at the clinic, and his parents were checking gauges out of habit more than need, and Keahi was probably calling from whichever volcano she was studying this month, and Sorrel was testing another prototype that would work or wouldn't, but would teach her something either way. The mountain breathed beneath them all, patient, vast, counting time in rhythms too slow for human comfort, but perfect for the work of shaping. Continents and teaching lessons that took lifetimes to learn. And on Ash's desk at home, the orb sat clear and empty and ready, its frost completely gone, its ice fully discharged, waiting for the next time someone needed to learn what time meant when you stopped trying to freeze it. The seventh hand continued its inward spiral, unhurried, certain, tracing paths through stone that had been there since the mountain was young and would remain until it was old. And in 1,000 years or 10,000, when it completed its circuit and reversed direction, beginning the long spiral back toward the outer rings, someone would be there to witness it. Someone would stand at the rim and watch the filaments dance and understand, or begin to understand, that the truest clock doesn't tell you what time it is, but teaches you what time means. How to live inside it. How to respect it. How to let it flow through you like heat through stone, taking what warmth you need, giving back what cold you must, and trusting the cycle to balance itself across spans too vast for human worry, but perfect for the deep, slow breathing of mountains. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.